Hey, everybody. Glad you're here. A little bit later than usual, but that's how we do it on Wednesdays. Glad you're here. We're going to have yet another great late night conversation. Let's go.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action. Welcome, everybody. I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. We're going to have yet another great late night conversation. We're going to be following our normal format. So if you've got something you would like me to talk about in the second half of the show, you can send questions, Rumble Rants, Cash App, Caleb Moppin 22. The best way is buy me a coffee. Buy me a coffee is the best way. And somebody's already sent. We already have one question already sent in. Buy me a coffee is a great way to send your questions. Very quick. Boom, boom, boom. I get your questions. First, my opening remarks, then the roll call, then I answer your questions. Now, we're going to have a very special event coming up in New Jersey on January 11th. It's going to be tremendous. It's going to be a great event on January 11th. Center for Political Innovation is going to kick off our new year. We're going to honor some very important activists in New Jersey. We're going to have good speeches, good food, good music. It's going to be a great event at a hotel near the Newark airport. So go ahead and register and join us in New Jersey on January 11th. It's going to be a great event. Hope to see you there. Join the Center for Political Innovation. We're doing great stuff. We have our Wednesday night active members check-in. And we just had a great meeting. And it was great. And a good number of people there. We're doing stuff in LA. We're doing stuff in Minneapolis. We're doing stuff in Massachusetts. And we're doing stuff in New York. And we're doing stuff in Chicago. And I mean, it's great. We got a great organization. We are dedicated to building a real anti-imperialist movement out there, doing outreach, dare to struggle, dare to win. Long live the Center for Political Innovation. Hope you join us in New Jersey to kick off a new year of organizing. A lot of great stuff. On Sunday, I am going to be in the streets of New York City to support Hak Jahan Moon. Dr. Hak Jahan is in jail in South Korea, trumped up political charges. She's one of the main advocates of peace with North Korea. And I'm looking to be in the streets of New York City on Sunday with people from her church, from her movement, to raise the case of freeing Dr. Hak Jahan Moon. And so a lot is going on. Many different causes. Uhuru. We were just in D.C. to support the Uhuru movement, and all kinds of great stuff is happening. So yeah, we're just going to have a normal stream here tonight. If you got questions, you can send a Rumble Rant. You can Cash App me at Caleb Moppin 22. The best way to send your questions for the second half of our show is buy me a coffee. First, the opening remarks, then our roll call, and then I answer your questions for the remainder of the night. So, folks, politics in our time is so weird. We are living a very, very strange political time. And if I've learned anything in the past couple months, couple years, it's that, it ain't over till it's over. Just because CNN is screaming something doesn't make it true. And that we live in an evolving, strange political landscape. And so, look, we have been talking about Epstein on this channel from day one. And I have been supporting Marjorie Taylor Greene and other people that want the Epstein files released, that are standing with the Epstein victims. We have been saying what Whitney Webb has been saying, that Epstein is an Israeli intelligence operative. And, but as far as Trump and Epstein, he said he was going to release all the Epstein stuff. He didn't do it. And I don't even know what to make of what we're seeing right now. And I've just learned, you don't jump the gun. But, I think that Trump's victory in the 2024 election was good, not because I expected Trump to do anything necessarily. I hoped he would, but because the American people were presented with the option of one candidate who's saying no more foreign wars and I'm going to end the Ukraine war, and another candidate who said, I don't care who wins. Another candidate who said they were going to prolong the war in Ukraine until Ukraine won, which whatever that means. One candidate who said he was going to protect free speech. Another candidate who wanted a government crackdown on quote unquote disinformation and foreign influence. A candidate whose Department of Justice had raided the home of Scott Ritter and raided the home of the Uhuru movement and dragged the Uhuru movement into federal court. The American people were told, we got one guy who says he believes in free speech, one guy who says he wants to stop wars around the world, and we got another candidate, Kamala Harris, who says that she wants to continue the wars around the world, and on top of that said that she wants a crackdown on people with anti-imperialist views. Now, Trump got into office, and what did we get? We got more wars around the world. He bombed Iran. He didn't release the Epstein files like he said he would, and the war in Ukraine hasn't ended, and he cracked down on the free speech rights of the Palestine protesting students, and he said he was going to fix the inflation, and he hasn't done it. So I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. All I can say is that our principles, we stand by our principles. Look, we are for anti-imperialism. We are for a government of action that fights for working families. I don't know what's going to happen with Trump. I don't know what's going on. I mean, the government is supposed to turn back on momentarily. We've seen what's all over CNN. We've seen what Trump has said about it. I don't even know. We just gotta. I've learned, don't jump the gun. That's what I've learned. Do not jump the gun, and just kind of, don't rush into saying something. We don't know how this is going to play out, but I mean, we're in a weird place politically. I'm hugely disappointed 1 year into Trump's second term. I'll tell you that much. And I've been saying that pretty consistently. I think we'd be in a lot worse place if Kamala Harris had won the election, though, because Kamala Harris was promising to be bad. And she would have had an electoral mandate to be bad, whereas Donald Trump had an electoral mandate to do good things, and he's done the opposite. So we're in a weird spot. Like I said, the best hope in our politics right now is Tulsi Gabbard, the intelligence director who revealed the Russiagate hoax. We've got Thomas Massey. We've got Marjorie Taylor Greene. There are some people within the government apparatus that seem to be consistent in not wanting wars around the world and not wanting a deep state that violates our civil liberties and not wanting Israel to run our government and not wanting to give the people that collaborated with Jeffrey Epstein a free pass. So we're going to just have to see how all of this develops. And I urge you to not jump the gun either, right? There's a big demand. Part of social media culture is this demand that everyone just immediately rush into saying things before we know the whole story, before the dust clears. Well, we're going to see what happens. And when we know, we'll act accordingly. But we have always been principled in CPI, and we have always taken the right stance, and we will continue to do that. And because things are not clear, tonight I had the idea that on tonight's stream, I would dig into some esoteric politics. Because that's what we do here, right? We're really good at esoteric politics. There's all this talk about how the Trotskyists, about the Neoconservatives have roots in Trotskyism. So I wrote the book on the esoteric politics of Trotskyism and neoconservatism and the Fourth International and all of that. I like this esoteric politics. And that's why you're here, right? If we were just talking about Democrats and Republicans, you would be bored. We're here to talk about the nitty gritty, the complicated politics. So tonight we're going to do a deep dive into revisionism and anti-revisionism, right? Because this is a part of communism. It was a really big deal in the 20th century. It's still kind of a big deal. If you want to understand China and what China's roots are, if you want to understand different communist groups and where they came from, revisionism and anti-revisionism. What does any of this mean? The word revisionism, right? It just means to revise, right? If a writer writes a manuscript and then he revises it. Or maybe he hires someone to go through his manuscript and improve it. That person that he hires might be a revisionist because they are making revisions. The word revisionist has many different implications. For example, one common usage of the term is if you are somebody who questions the events of the Second World War and what the Nazis did, you are called a historical revisionist or a Holocaust revisionist. That has a totally different meaning than what the term revisionist means in Marxism. I had a teacher in high school, and I remember I told her about communist groups, and I said, some communist groups think Stalin did nothing wrong. And she said, oh, those are the revisionists, right? And I said, no. She didn't, but she had heard of Holocaust revisionists, so she assumed communist revisionists were people that revise the history of no. Totally different thing. The other thing is Likud, the ruling party of Israel. What were they originally called? They were called the Revisionist Party. And why is that? Because originally there was the World Zionist Organization founded by Theodore Herzl, and they were social democrats. Very interesting, right? Originally, Zionism was associated with the Second International, with the British Labour Party, and with social democracy. And there were a number of Zionists who did not agree with that, who began arguing that instead of embracing social democracy, Jews should orient themselves towards supporting fascism and nationalism rather than social democracy. And I think it was Jacobinsky was the founder of the Revisionist Party, and revisionist Zionism was a split from the World Zionist Organization, and they were called the Revisionist Party. And they were a group of people in Israel that were Zionists that were not social democrats. They were rather nationalists. And many of the revisionist Zionists praised Adolf Hitler and such. And that's a completely different meaning than the word revisionist has in the communist sense. So, you have historical revisionists, you have revisionist Zionism versus regular Zionism. The word revisionist has many different connotations. In Marxism, I'm going to go over the history of the word revisionism in Marxism, what revisionism means, and what anti-revisionism means. And we're going to talk about this, right? And again, it has nothing to do with historical revisionism, has nothing to do with Zionist revisionism. It's a completely different connotation, completely different term. And most of the people who use the word revisionist in Marxist internet discourse, if you get on X or on Facebook and Left Book or whatever, most of the people that talk about revisionism and accuse people of being revisionists don't know what the word actually means, don't understand the context of any of this. It's not obvious. None of this stuff is obvious, right? And that's one of the problems. I'll just be honest about one of the big problems that Marxism has is that Marxism uses words differently than they are used in standard English. And it expects people that are not part of the Marxist current to understand that these words have different meaning. For example, Marxists will always talk about the contradictions. The contradictions. What is that? What is that, right? Well, in common language, if you disagree with somebody, if someone says the sky is blue and you say, no, it is not, the sky is red, you are contradicting them. Well, that's not what Marxists mean when they say contradictions. What they mean is they're referring to the fact that the conflict drives history, and that there are two things that cannot coexist with each other, and they come into conflict, and that one is the thesis and the other is the antithesis, and they clash and they create a synthesis, and then that synthesis becomes the new thesis that clashes with the new antithesis, and that this is the theory of how history is driven forward, the Hegelian dialectic, right? This is a big part of the Marxist view of how history is driven forward. So contradiction refers to conflict between existing entities driving history forward. But you wouldn't know that. Another term that's used, right, that Marx has used is materialist, right? When I was a kid in church, they were always talking against materialism. What did they mean? They meant stuff, people who were obsessed with having lots of money or having lots of goods. They meant consumerism. And so when communist groups, I would hear and I thought they were talking about, I associated what I heard from Christians as their critique of consumer culture and consumerism. I assumed, they called it materialism. I assumed that that was, one of the bad things about capitalism. So then I encountered the communists, and the communists are always talking about, we need materialism. We need to fight for materialism. I'd be like, I thought we're against materialism. Well, I had to learn that in the Marxist sense, materialism refers to a philosophy, the philosophy of dialectical and historical materialism, the belief that all that exists in the world is matter, and that thought is simply a reflection of the material world, but that matter is constantly in motion, right? Dialectical and historical materialism has nothing to do with wanting lots of stuff, right? And so there's so many examples of this, right? And one of the biggest things, one of the most cringe things, is you see people don't explain this. There's no introductory 101 where they explain this to people. So people show up in leftist or Marxist circles, they hear these words and they assume they know what they mean, and they don't, because Marxists are not using these words in the way that standard English is used. And so they use the word wrong. Classic example, at Occupy Wall Street, misuse of the term reactionary was constantly being used, and it drove me up the wall, right? In Marxist political jargon, right? If you are somebody who is on the right side, you're deemed progressive. If you're somebody who is a defender of the status quo, you are deemed conservative or whatever. But if you're considered very extreme, you want to move history backward, you're what's called a reactionary, right? Reactionary ideas are people that want to go backwards. Leftists view themselves as progressive, wanting to advance into the future. And people that want to roll history backwards are called reactionaries. However, at Occupy Wall Street, all kinds of young 20-year-olds who were not familiar with the Marxist, buzzwords and all the misuse and the way Marxists use words, when people would start arguing with other people, they'd say, stop being so reactionary. You're being so reactionary by yelling at that guy. No, they're not being reactionary. They're being reactive. They're being emotional, right? But the term reactionary, don't be reactionary. It was like, if you disagree with somebody, don't start yelling at them. Don't be reactionary. That's not what that word means. But they didn't know that, right? They didn't know that. And there's many examples of this. The word neoliberal, for example. Neoliberalism is an economic theory. It's an economic theory that is primarily promoted by conservatives. Now, at this point, liberals also tend to promote neoliberal economics, but it doesn't refer to liberals and conservatives in politics. It refers to liberalism in terms of individualism, and it's the belief that the state should not be involved in managing the economy. Neoliberalism and economic theories of neoliberalism were primarily promoted by conservatives and Republicans. However, many people, I'm glad you appreciate this. I'm not the only person who's seen this. Many people hear the term neoliberal and assume that it means moderate Democrat. That we have neoconservative Republicans, so we have neoliberals. That's not what the term means. Neoliberal refers to an economic theory that the state should not be involved in managing the economy. It has nothing to do, it is not the opposite of a neoconservative, right? It is not related to liberals and conservatives, Democrats versus Republicans at all. It's an economic theory. And so there's just so many examples of this, of words being used in Marxist circles in ways that are different than they are used in the general public, people not knowing this and using them wrong, and it just gets to be a big mess. It just gets to be a big mess. So tonight we're just going to talk about the word revisionist, what it means, and what anti-revisionism is. Okay? That's what we're going to talk about tonight. All right. So I'm going to take you back to the 1890s. Back in the 1890s, Karl Marx was dead. What year did Karl Marx die? Like 1880 something, right? Karl Marx was dead. When did he die? Karl Marx died in 1883. So Karl Marx was dead in 1890. However, his movement had skyrocketed. Marxism was everywhere in 1890 and 1895. 1900, Marxism was at its peak. The political party that had been started by Friedrich Engels Frederick Engels, Marx's close collaborator, had helped establish the German Social Democratic Workers' Party, the SPD. And that party was, by many accounts, the largest political party in the world at the time. It had millions of members. They had tried to outlaw it in Germany, and by outlawing it, they'd only made it more popular. And the British Labour Party was rising, and you had, various socialist groups. The Socialist Party of America, Eugene Debs, was rising in popularity. Socialism was at its height, and social democracy was the label that most Marxists used, right? They had been the first international, the International Working Men's Association that Marx had formed in his life. He had formed it with a bunch of anarchists. They'd had a fight, and it eventually fell apart. And then after Marx's death, the Second International emerged. The Second International used the label of social democracy to describe itself. And they were promoting Karl Marx's ideas, and there were millions of people. And the labor movement, labor unions, industrial unions of factory workers were rising, and workers were going on strike, and members of parliament from social democratic parties were being elected. And all over Europe, social democracy and Marxism were becoming very, very, very popular. And so there was a problem, though, because everything that Marx had predicted was not coming true. Marx had predicted that the workers of America and Britain and France and Germany would just keep getting poorer, that the capitalist economy would just keep getting less and less stable, and that as a result, the factory workers, there'd be more and more unemployment among the factory workers. They would have no choice but to rise up and seize control of the government and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. And with the dictatorship of the proletariat, they then would create a centrally planned economy. That's what Karl Marx predicted. And in 1890, 1895, 1900, what Marx had predicted was not happening, even though there was a huge political movement based on Marx's ideas. It didn't happen. So what was wrong? And people began to refer to this period from about 1900 up until World War I started in 1914 as the crisis of Marxism, because Marxism was everywhere, and the economy of Europe was not doing what Marx had said it was going to do. And the movement that Marx had created, the Marxist movement, was not overthrowing capitalism and creating a revolution. And even though Marxism was everywhere and everyone was studying it and labor unions were being formed and Marxists were being elected, the economy was not getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, it was stabilizing. And on top of that, workers were not rising up and overthrowing capitalism. They were electing people to office and passing reforms. So what was going on? Well, we know what was going on was that imperialism was happening, that the Western capitalist countries were moving into the monopolistic stage of imperialism or globalism, right? That the corporations in America and Britain and France and Germany were spreading their tentacles all over the planet. And as a result, they were making and raking in super profits. And the amount of wealth that was going into the pockets of American and British and French and German corporations was much higher than ever before. And because these corporations were spreading their tentacles all over the planet and making super profits, as a result, when certain skilled workers would go on strike and demand higher wages and things like that, the capitalists could give in. And the labor movement in the Western countries was becoming stratified between the skilled workers and the unskilled workers, right? It were the skilled workers and the industrial workers. Workers who just worked on an assembly line were considered unskilled. They got very low wages. But workers who, went through an apprenticeship, learned a skilled trade, carpenters, craftsmen, bricklayers, stonemasons, they were getting higher pay, right? And the guilds and the craftsmen, the skilled workers, the tradesmen, they were getting higher pay, and the industrial workers were not. And this division within the labor movement was causing the labor movement to become less and less radical, because the skilled workers, the craftsmen, had more money, and they tended to dominate the socialist groups. And because they had more money, they tended to water down the politics. And socialism was kind of turning into a movement to just stabilize capitalism. And a lot of the leading Marxists could see this, and they didn't like it. However, there was one guy named Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein came out and he said, this is good. And he said, what we need to just embrace the fact that there isn't going to be a revolution, and that Marx was just a bit too radical, and that capitalism is just naturally kind of turning into socialism. And he called this theory revisionism. He called it that. It was not a slur. People didn't call him a revisionist. No, he called himself a revisionist. He wrote books about revisionism. He called it evolutionary socialism as opposed to revolutionary socialism. He said he's a revisionist Marxist, and Edward Bernstein and his followers were called the revisionists, and the revisionist movement, the revisionists. And their slogan was, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. That was what they said. It's all about the movement. It's not about the goal. And they said, there's not going to be an event horizon. There's not going to be a revolution. There's not going to be one day we wake up and we're in socialism. It's going to come gradually. And at first, and the big thing that they said was going to guarantee that socialism came was universal male suffrage. They said every man can vote. In a lot of European countries, they adopted universal male suffrage. Right? They weren't even thinking about letting women vote, but universal male suffrage. Every adult male got to vote. And they said there's clearly more working class males than there are capitalist males. So the working class males will outvote the capitalist males. And so we're going to have dictatorship of the proletariat because they have the majority of the vote. And because of that, we're going to pass, and that in Britain, they passed the 12-hour workday. And in Germany, they created a national health service, a national health service, and kindergarten was created. Daycare, basically, kindergarten, universal education in kindergarten was created. And all of this, Edward Bernstein said, was proof that the Western system just kind of naturally turns into socialism, and that Marx had it wrong when he said that the working people were just going to keep getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and that they would eventually have to have a violent revolution. He said, no. It's just gradually, through the democratic process, the West is going to become socialist. And Edward Bernstein was a big supporter of colonialism and imperialism because the West is already moving towards socialism with the universal male suffrage and the 12-hour workday. So if we go conquer some primitive African country, or if we go conquer some Asian country, that's bringing them closer to us, and we are the most advanced. That was revisionism. Edward Bernstein. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. He said socialism is nothing but the sum of reforms. All the reforms of capitalism just gradually add up into socialism. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. Socialism is the sum of reforms. Evolutionary socialism. That was revisionism. And not a slur. Edward Bernstein called himself a revisionist. And he was in favor of colonialism. And he was in favor of working class politicians getting elected. And he said we need to move away from the idea of having a revolution. And the Marxist movement, led by Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky was the leader of the German Social Democratic Party. And Karl Kautsky waged a fight against revisionism. And they had big conferences and conventions, and thousands of people would pile in and watch debates between Karl Kautsky and his followers versus Edward Bernstein and his followers. And that was kind of what made Karl Kautsky, the leader of the Second International, famous, was he repudiated revisionism and he fought the revisionists. And in fact, his book that he wrote on Christianity, right? Karl Kautsky wrote a book directed at German Christians to explain Christianity from a Marxist perspective. It's called The Foundations of Christianity. And this book is very good. It's a very good book, giving a Marxist analysis of the Roman Empire and Christianity and all of that. And this book even compares the sellout, watered down version of Christianity adopted by the Roman Empire to revisionism, right? And it says that the Romans, in order to try and stabilize their empire, they adopted this watered down version of Christianity, this religion they'd once suppressed. And it says that's what revisionism is, that, you know, that the Western capitalist system is collapsing. And so just like the Romans distorted and adopted a watered down version of Christianity, the Western capitalist system is distorting and adopting a watered down version of Marxism called revisionism. Very profound, actually. And the Second International, Karl Kautsky, waged a big fight against revisionism. And Lenin was on the side of Karl Kautsky and on the side of the Second International. And it was a big thing, the fight against revisionism. And the German Social Democrats and all of them said, we are not revisionists. And that's where the term comes from. It comes from this spin-off of Marxism that took place during the crisis of Marxism. But what happened? What happened? Well, as the crisis of Marxism continued, and as world got closer to World War I, the German Social Democrats, who had fought against the revisionists, when the time came, they supported World War I. Even though they'd done this whole thing about we're not going to abandon our principles and all of that, when the rubber met the road, they talked a great game. They could write great books against revisionism and such, but when World War I actually broke out, the German Social Democrats supported it. Rosa Luxemburg, who's a really, really important figure, right? You cannot underestimate the importance of Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg had been one of the main fighters against revisionism in Germany. She wrote the book Reform or Revolution, debunking the economics behind revisionist Marxism. She opposed World War I, and she was thrown in jail for opposing World War I. And Eugene Debs in the United States, he opposed World War I. He was thrown in jail for opposing World War I. And the Bolsheviks opposed World War I, and they eventually made a revolution on the basis of wanting to end World War I, peace, land, and bread. But even though the Marxist movement, the Second International, had repudiated revisionism and repudiated the idea that we have to water down Marxism, they really had essentially the same thing. They talked against it, but they really had become revisionist. And that was a big point that Lenin made in his arguments against the Second International. And Rosa Luxemburg said the same thing. These people might have talked against Edward Bernstein and talked against revisionism, but when the rubber met the road, they believed basically the same thing. And they led workers off to die in World War I, and they betrayed the working class movement, and they became foot soldiers of imperialism. And their Marxist movement, the Marxism of the British Labour Party, the Marxism of the Social Democrat Party, the Marxism of all the socialist groups, just became a vehicle for marching workers off to die. And we cannot emphasize enough how big of a betrayal World War I was. The fact that all these socialist and Marxist groups had said they would never send workers to kill other workers in a war. They were for working class solidarity. They were against capitalist wars. They all sold out. And all of them supported the war. And there was a very, very small minority that had the courage to actually oppose the war. Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Eugene Debs, that was about it. And the people who opposed the war got thrown in jail, got tortured. Rosa Luxemburg eventually was killed for her, her activism, and was, shot in the head and thrown in a river. And the betrayal, the fact that the Marxist movement betrayed its principles was like that. That was an essential part of what separated the Bolsheviks, who eventually took power in Russia, from the Marxist movement. It was that moment when Marxism as a political movement proved itself, this mass political movement of Marxism proved itself to be politically bankrupt and sent workers off to die. That was the moment where Bolshevism, the theories of Vladimir Lenin, became so vehemently opposed and at odds with the rest of Marxism. That's where the term communist comes from, right? When Lenin returned from exile in April of 1917, he wrote his April Theses, directing the Bolshevik Party what they should do. And one thing is he said, we've got to stop calling ourselves social democrats. We're going to call ourselves communists instead, because the social democrats are the ones who supported the war and betrayed the working class. And he said, instead of trying to fight and organize within social democracy, we're going to go lower and deeper to the real masses. And that the social democrats, they're not just wrong. They're not like our comrades who they're the enemy. And we're going to go lower and deeper. And the movement that we're building is not a more radical version of social democracy. We are against social democracy. And if you read what Lenin wrote about the fall of the Second International, it's really important because people have this idea of left unity now. Oh, we're all leftists. We're all the same. No, we're not. Read what Lenin said, right? World War I would not have happened without social democrats, without the AOCs and Bernie Sanders of the 1910s. You never would have had World War I. It wasn't a question of simply they didn't have the courage to oppose it. It was a question of they were part of it. And Lenin wrote about why. They had built this huge machine that was part of Western European society. All the labor unions, all the kindergartens, all the marching bands, they were part of the apparatus of imperialism. And that, the socialists had gone out and demanded that they build kindergartens and provide daycare. And the German Kaiser had said, that's a great idea. And I can have all the kids march and learn to be soldiers in the daycare. And, they had gone out and demanded the right that healthcare be provided. And the German Kaiser said, okay, I can set up a national healthcare system and I can tie it in with the military and it can be part of my military. And that a lot of the reforms that the Social Democrats had fought for were a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism and making it more effective imperialism. And that even though they may have on paper been something else, in essence, they were revisionists. They were what Edward Bernstein had wanted. They were gradually tweaking the Western imperialist system and helping imperialism conquer the world by adopting reforms and getting working class people to feel like they had some skin in the game. This is the concept of the aristocracy of labor, the idea that sections of the working class, higher paid workers, were bought off. And because they were bought off, they sympathized with imperialism because to some degree or other, if the British Empire, conquered new territories and other, they would get some of the wealth. Most of it would go to their bosses. But at the same time, some of it would trickle down to the well-paid workers. And that the skilled workers, the higher paid workers, the aristocracy of labor came to dominate the socialist groups. And as a result, the socialist groups became less and less revolutionary and more connected and loyal to carrying out imperialism. And the reforms they fought for may have been intended to build a movement to eventually overthrow capitalism, but they were really reforms that helped solidify and stabilize capitalism to build and conquer the world with imperialism. That is what the term revisionism originally meant, right? It was a breakaway from the Marxist movement that was opposed by the Marxist movement. But as the Marxist movement of Europe proved it was not revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and others said revisionism has won, and that that revisionism came to dominate what you call social democracy. So fast forward to the Second World War. During World War II, the communist movement was a really big deal because the communists were aligned with the Soviet Union. They were taking direction from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was the country that won the Second World War. It was the Soviet Union that took Berlin. It was the Red Army in China that fought against Japan. On the Korean Peninsula, it was communists that were fighting against Japan. It was underground communist resistance fighters in France that were fighting the Nazis. It was the Italian partisan brigades, that fought Mussolini in Italy and eventually killed Mussolini and hung him upside down. You can see the famous photo of him, after they killed him. It was communists who killed Mussolini. And, communists were a really, really big deal in the Second World War. Pretty big deal. And, in China, they were fighting Japan, the Red Army. No country gave more lives to the struggle to defeat Hitler than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union liberated Eastern Europe and eventually took Berlin and defeated the Nazis. Communism was a really, 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 really big deal during the Second World War. In, every corner of the globe, pretty much, and also in America. We did have a very big communist party at that time in the United States. In New York City, 2 of the city council seats were run by communists. Vito Marcantonio was a member of the House of Representatives who was a very close friend of the Communist Party. He was representing Harlem in the U.S. Congress. And then 2 city council seats were held by members of the Communist Party. Peter Cashoni, the Italian-American, and Benjamin Davis, the African-American. And both of them had New York City council seats. There was a congressman in Minnesota who was a Communist Party fellow traveler, read the Communist Party newspaper into the congressional record. Roosevelt frequently met with leaders of communist labor unions at the White House. Gilbert Green, the leader of the Young Communist League, actually slept over at the White House. And the communists were a really big part of the Roosevelt coalition, though they didn't agree with Roosevelt on everything. Roosevelt was the leader of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was the party of Jim Crow segregation. And the communists were against racism, and the communists frequently put up the anti-lynching bill. And Roosevelt and the Democrats would vote it down every time because of the Jim Crow wing of the Democratic Party. But the communists, because they ran the labor unions and because they were aligned with the Soviet Union and because they were dedicated to fighting fascism, they were a really, really big part of the Roosevelt coalition. And Roosevelt was the president. Henry Wallace was the vice president. And Henry Wallace was an open admirer of Stalin. He was the vice president. He'd been the secretary of agriculture. He was an admirer of Stalin. He was, had been a member of the Socialist Party. And, the communists were a big part of the Roosevelt coalition. So during World War II, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States was a guy named Earl Browder. And Earl Browder is widely viewed as a corrupt politician. And Earl Browder, because the Communist Party was an important part of the Roosevelt coalition, Earl Browder was frequently meeting with, government officials and the State Department and such. And during World War II, the policy of the Communist Party was everything for victory. They focused on defeating the Nazis. All their members that were men signed up and joined the military. It was correct to support the United States against the Nazis in World War II. However, they took it to some pretty ridiculous extremes. For example, they supported Japanese internment, which is pretty awful, right? And they basically expelled all their Japanese members and sent them a letter saying, comply with being interned. That was pretty fucked up. The other thing that they did was the Communist Party dissolved in 1942. And they weren't told to do that by Stalin. It was Earl Browder's idea, basically, because the Soviet Union was saying everything for victory. Earl Browder said, you know what? We're going to dissolve the Communist Party, and we're going to call it the Communist Political Association. That way, no one thinks we're a political party. No one thinks we're trying to hurt the war effort. And so the Communist Party had an emergency convention in Madison Square Garden and dissolved. And they liquidated, and they became the Communist Political Association. The Young Communist League changed its name to the American Youth for Democracy, and the Communist Party was the Communist Political Association. And when Stalin and Roosevelt met in Tehran, they, put forward a plan that the Soviet Union and America would be allies after Nazi Germany was defeated. And Earl Browder was so excited by that, he wrote a book called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace, where he declared that after World War II, the Soviet Union and America would merge into one country. They would merge into one country. And the new country, the Union of the United States of Russia and America, or whatever the hell it was going to be called, would combine the best elements of both capitalism and communism, and Russia and America would be one country, and that one country would have one party, the Democratic Republican Party. The Democrats and the Republicans would merge into one single party. And on the basis of anti-fascism and democracy, capitalism and socialism would become one system. And the Soviet Union and America would become one country. And there was no more class struggle. There would be no more strikes. There'd be a permanent no strike pledge. It was a nutty, nutty idea that Earl Browder came up with at the end of the Second World War. It was cuckoo. And it was basically just throwing out any pretense of being anti-imperialist, being revolutionary, and basically just saying that Rooseveltism and Stalin, Soviet communism are basically, they're the same thing. And we're just going to kind of merge them into this vaguely anti-fascist democratic system that we're going to build. It was pretty crazy. And what happened? Well, Roosevelt died. Harry Truman became the president. And right after Harry Truman became president, the USA dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And pretty clearly, even before World War II had ended, the U.S. government was making clear the Soviet Union was the new enemy. And they were recruiting Nazi people to join what eventually became the CIA, the Office of Security Services, I believe it was called at that point, and that anti-communist propaganda started going up everywhere. And at the end of the Second World War, it was made very clear that what they had hoped for, what had been promised in the Tehran Accords, the idea that the USA and the Soviet Union would become best friends forever after World War II, that wasn't going to happen. Roosevelt was dead, and U.S. imperialism was at odds with the Soviet Union. And so it just became clear that, what this crap Earl Browder had come up with, dissolving the Communist Party and all of this was ridiculous. So the Communist Party had an emergency convention, but before they had an emergency convention, a French communist named Jacques Duclos wrote an article for a French newspaper condemning Earl Browder. And he wrote this article and he basically said, Earl Browder, the leader of the U.S. Communist Party, is nuts. And he's not a communist. And he dissolved the Communist Party. And he has these crazy ideas about Tehran and no more class struggle. And this is cuckoo. This isn't serious. And this French communist article written by Jacques Duclos was sent all over the world by Stalin. So it basically had Stalin's endorsement. Mao Zedong really liked it. Mao in China hated Earl Browder. And there were a number of instances where the Chinese communists had called up the American Communist Party and said, can you please demand the American government give more guns to the Chinese communists? And the American Communist Party refused to do it because they were in touch with the State Department. And like Mao hated Earl Browder, couldn't stand Earl Browder. Stalin endorsed this article condemning Earl Browder. So after this article by Jacques Duclos was sent all over the world, at that point, they had an emergency convention of the Communist Party and they expelled Earl Browder. And they kicked out Earl Browder. And Earl Browder was given the opportunity to repent, basically, and change his position. He wouldn't do it. So Earl Browder was expelled from the Communist Party. And so then the Communist Party of the United States, they got a lot of attention. And Mao sent a personal letter to William Z. Foster, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States, congratulating him on the defeat of Earl Browder. And Stalin praised William Z. Foster for kicking out Earl Browder. And the Communist Party of the United States launched the anti-Browder campaign. And the anti-Browder campaign was the beginning of what you might call anti-revisionism. When William Z. Foster, he wrote a book, Revisionism versus Marxism, and called out Earl Browder for being a revisionist and said that Earl Browder had been a revisionist and compared him to Edward Bernstein, compared him to the Second International, and said that Earl Browder's, liquidating the Communist Party, saying class struggle was no longer necessary. This was revisionism. And it was the American Communist Party that largely, kind of originated what you might call anti-revisionism. It was William Z. Foster launched and led the anti-Browder campaign. And that was the first anti-revisionist movement. It had Stalin's endorsement, and it was all over the world. All the communist magazines all over the world in all kinds of different languages were condemning Browderism and Earl Browder, and they condemned Earl Browder, and Browder was a revisionist. It was very interesting, right? Very interesting. And it goes to show you, you know, we think America is like insignificant in the world of communism. America is very insignificant, right? It's very significant in communism. The fact that there was a global campaign against Browderism, that Mao Zedong was commenting on it, and all the Soviet magazines were talking about Browderite revisionism and Browderism. So there was the anti-Browder campaign. Now, what's interesting is there were a number of people who'd been kicked out of the Communist Party by Earl Browder who didn't rejoin, right? There was a guy named Harrison George, I believe, in America. Harrison George. There was the leader of the Dock Workers Union in San Francisco, a guy named Samuel Darcy. And that at the time the Communist Party was waging their anti-Browder campaign, there were a number of people Browder had kicked out of the Communist Party who felt that it was not sincere. And they argued that Browderism had become permanently entrenched, and that Foster was still a Browderist, right? And that Foster had not called out Browder until the very end and all of that. And so there were some magazines that were started by people who'd been kicked out of the Communist Party by Earl Browder, who still liked Stalin, still liked the Soviet Union, but they felt that the American Communist Party was no good, right? And it was weird. And there were some people in India who said similar things. They'd been kicked out of the Indian Communist Party, and they liked Stalin and they liked the Soviet Union, but they felt that the Indian Communist Party was still Browderist and still revisionist, right? And so there started to be like critics of mainstream communism that liked Stalin, liked the Soviet Union, didn't like Earl Browder, didn't like Browderism, but felt that Browderist tendencies, the reformism, the go along with Roosevelt, go along with the Democrats, you know, water down communism in the name of anti-fascism, had become entrenched. And so that was something. But, you know, so what happened, right? What happened? Well, you know, the Cold War got going. The Communist Party of the United States was outlawed, and you had McCarthyism. A lot of people went to jail, but all over the world, communism was a really big deal coming out of World War II. The French Communist Party surged in popularity, got millions of votes in elections. The Italian Communist Party was rising. You know, China had the revolution of 1949, and the Communist Party became the ruling party of China. And North Korea, you had the Korean War, where the Korean Workers' Party battled against, you know, the United Nations forces, and there was the Korean War, and you know, in Indonesia, you had the rise of a communist-aligned government of Sukarno in Indonesia, and a lot of Latin American countries, you saw the rise of communism. In Guatemala, you had a president named Arbenz, who was not a communist, but he legalized the Communist Party and wanted a better relationship with the Soviet Union. So the USA overthrew the government of Guatemala, installed a military dictatorship in 1953. And that communism was kind of riding high coming out of World War II, and Stalin was the leader. And then what happened? Stalin died, and there was a power struggle within the Soviet government. And the two leaders that were battling for power were Molotov, who was Stalin's right-hand man. Molotov means hammer. Molotov was the pro-Stalin faction who wanted to continue what Stalin was doing, and Khrushchev was the anti-Stalin leader. And they battled it out. Stalin died in 1953. For 3 years, they battled it out. Finally, 1956, they convened. They had the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev took power, and Khrushchev took a gigantic dump all over Stalin. And he gave the secret speech of 1956, which was full of lies, straight up lies about Stalin, things that were absurd, claiming Stalin had started crying when he heard Hitler invaded, the Soviet Union, and started hiding under his desk, and that Stalin was obsessed with his personal image and wanted to ride a white horse and all kinds of crap. And I've written a whole thing about Khrushchev's secret speech and Khrushchevism and the damage it did to the international communist movement. The Khrushchev secret speech was like a devastating blow. People committed suicide as a result of it. People cried. People, the American Communist Party had been outlawed and underground, and they were starting to function legally. And then when the secret speech happened, 2/3 of the people that were still with them after everything they'd been through just walked away and quit. I mean, it was a devastating blow. It was a devastating blow to the global communist movement, the secret speech. And it came as a big shock, and people didn't quite know what to do about it. In America, the leader of the Communist Party at the time the secret speech was made, he came out and he wrote a document called Communists Take a New Look. And this document, you can read Communists Take a New Look. You read it. They basically said they were going to dissolve, and they were just going to become a regular socialist party. They were going to merge with the Socialist Party of America, and they were going to dissolve. And then in Hungary, there was an anti-communist uprising in 1956, sponsored by the CIA. A lot of fascists were rising up against the Hungarian government. But the Communist Party of the United States ran articles in their Daily Worker, in their newspaper, supporting it. And Jean-Paul Sartre and a lot of intellectuals in France who've been associated with the Communist Party were supporting the anti-communist uprising in Hungary. And that there was a whole lot of, of confusion as a result of Khrushchev's secret speech. And after Khrushchev's secret speech, Molotov voted to remove Khrushchev. The Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party voted to remove Khrushchev, and Molotov had the majority of the votes. And Khrushchev brought in the military and arrested Molotov. And Molotov and his allies were thrown in prison. They were the anti-party group, they were called. So Stalin's allies were removed from the Central Committee. Khrushchev solidified his control. And then the Soviet Union announced they were engaging in what was called de-Stalinization, meaning that they were going to roll back the policies of Stalin. De-Stalinization, they called it. And part of de-Stalinization was they were going to have better relations with the United States, that they were going to have a better relationship with the United States. At first, China embraced de-Stalinization. And this is a little known fact. But at first, China thought de-Stalinization was a good idea. And they published a few documents that were critical of Stalin. One of them is called on the historical experience of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it echoed the claim about Khrushchev, about cult of personality and all of this. And at first, China was thinking, okay, de-Stalinization might be a good idea. And they launched what was called the 100 Flowers campaign in China. Mao said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. And the Chinese government started printing anti-communist books and things like that, because in the name of de-Stalinization, we want to have openness, right? And that, the de-Stalinization was happening. And at first, China supported it. At first. But then it became clear that a big part of de-Stalinization was stopping anti-colonial movements around the world. Khrushchev declared that the United States had the atomic bomb. And because the United States had the atomic bomb, having revolutions was too dangerous. And so Khrushchev came out with what he called the doctrine of the three peacefuls. Now, this is very important because this is something that people don't understand also. The doctrine of the three peacefuls. Khrushchev came out and he said that the United States has the atomic bomb. And so it's too dangerous for countries around the world to have communist revolutions anymore. And so what we need is peaceful coexistence between communist and capitalist countries. We just have to assume that the capitalist countries are always going to be there and the socialist countries are always going to be there, and there's just peaceful coexistence. And then we'll have peaceful competition. And what we'll do is we'll just prove that our socialist system is just so good at churning out material goods. We'll compete with the West. We'll make more shit than America. We will get the industries revved up. We have efficient socialist central planning, and we'll prove that socialist central planning can make TVs and radios and cars and material goods better than America. We'll have peaceful competition. That's where the quote, "we will bury you," from Khrushchev comes from. They bury you with material goods. We're just going to prove with our socialist system we can make shit. We can make more shit than America can with peaceful competition. And as a result of our peaceful competition, the West will have a gradual, peaceful transition to socialism. That was Khrushchev's theory. Bull honky, bullshit. I mean, it was ridiculous. So the idea, first of all, the Soviet Union couldn't produce more material goods than the West. And I mean, they were on a lower level of development. The whole country, they'd lost 27 million people in World War II. Prior to World War II, they had just industrialized with Stalin's 5-year plans. The Soviet Union, they were starting at a way lower level than the United States. There was no way that the Soviet Union was going to be able to build more shit than America. What the Soviet Union accomplished in terms of economic growth was a miracle. I mean, they had one of the highest rates of GDP growth in the world. They industrialized the whole place. They electrified the whole place. They built hospitals. They lifted people out of poverty. But the idea that the Soviet Union was going to be able to just create more TVs and radios and refrigerators than America, that was not possible. And on top of that, you had the nuclear arms race, that the USA started building giant nukes. And so the Soviet Union had to spend a lot of their budget on, instead of building radios and TVs, they had to build nukes. It was not a nuclear arms race. It was an arms catch-up. The USA would build nukes. The Soviet Union would catch up. Then they'd build more nukes. Then they'd have to catch up. And so the Soviet Union was forced to spend a lot of money on its military. And the idea that the Soviet Union was going to be able to just make more shit than America, it wasn't going to work. And also the idea that the USA would allow countries around the world that were socialist to just keep being socialist countries, that was absurd. And the notion that the Western capitalist countries would just see, the Soviet Union, their system is more efficient. I guess we'll just give up our power. We'll just adopt their system. That was also absurd. Khrushchev's theory of the three peacefuls was a crazy theory. And China didn't buy it. And if you read the documents that the Chinese Communist Party published, the Chinese Communist Party started publishing documents against Khrushchev. And the first ones were not directed against Khrushchev. They were directed against Togliatti. There's a piece called The Differences Between Comrade Togliatti and Us. And Togliatti was the leader of the Italian Communist Party, who is a Khrushchevist. And Mao and the Chinese Communist Party called out Togliatti, the differences between Comrade Togliatti and us. And eventually they published, critique of the general line of the global communist movement. And then they published Long Live Leninism. And the Chinese Communist Party was basically just announcing to the world, we don't agree with Khrushchev. We just don't agree with the Khrushchev line. And at that point, China started hailing Stalin and saying Stalin was good. Khrushchev has betrayed Stalin. Originally, China had supported de-Stalinization, but they saw the way Khrushchev was taking things. So China started putting up Stalin's picture everywhere and honoring Stalin and saying Khrushchev was betraying Stalin's line. And what that was, they were gesturing to Molotov. They were hoping that the Molotov wing of the Soviet Communist Party would take power. That's what they were hoping for. They were hoping that the Molotov wing, the pro-Stalin wing of the Soviet Communist Party would have a coup and take power again. And that's why they were building up Stalin. And that's important. These things there's a lot of nuance in all of this. So in anti-revisionism became the Chinese Communist Party's critique of the Soviet foreign policy. That was anti-revisionism. And around the world, people who liked Stalin started forming new communist parties that were taking direction from China and not the Soviet Union. And the first group in America was called Hammer and Steel. Why did they get their name Hammer and Steel? Molotov means hammer. Stalin means man of steel. So they were Hammer and Steel, Molotov and Stalin. Hammer and Steel was started in Boston. It was two communists in Boston, a guy named Homer Chase and his wife. They started their own group, Hammer and Steel. And there's now what's left of it. It's still around. It's called Rayolite Group. It's kind of a secretive communist group that works within labor unions called the Rayolite Group. Cindy Sheehan, was the peace mom who protested against Bush. She was around the Rayolite Group for a while. I don't know if she's still affiliated with them or not, but the Rayolite Group was the first anti-revisionist party in America. There were a bunch of people that were kicked out of the Communist Party for defending Stalin and for defending the Black Belt thesis. And in fact, that was the main issue. After the Communist Party of the United States embraced Khrushchev's secret speech, they also denounced black nationalism. The Communist Party had taken the position that black people are a nation. They are an oppressed nation within U.S. borders. And when they embraced Khrushchev, they said that black people are not a nation any longer. Black people are instead, they are a group that suffers from discrimination. And that was a big change. And there were a number of people in the Communist Party who did not accept that and said black people are a nation. Most of their black leaders were sympathetic to black nationalism to some degree. And so Harry Haywood and Nelson Peary and a lot of their black leaders left the Communist Party on the basis of opposing the Black Belt thesis. And you had something called the Provisional Organizing Committee that was formed, which was like an anti-revisionist breakaway from the Communist Party. And all over the world, different new communist parties were formed. Now, only one country 100% sided with China against the Soviet Union, Albania. Albania, when China and the Soviet Union parted ways, Albania also parted ways with the Soviet Union. And why? Because Albania was right next to Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was the first communist country to denounce Stalin. Tito cut ties with Stalin in 1948. And Albania hated Yugoslavia. So Albania loved Stalin. And right after Khrushchev took power, Khrushchev tried to reestablish ties with Yugoslavia, which was very offensive to Albania. So Albania rejected Khrushchev's secret speech, and Albania declared that they were super pro-Stalin. And when China denounced Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, Albania echoed that. And Albania, because Yugoslavia had denounced Stalin, Albania was super pro-Stalin. And that was the basis. So Enver Hoxha in Albania and China, they were one solid block within global communism, the anti-revisionist bloc. Most of the communist parties followed the Soviet Union, but there were a couple that were neutral. I think East Germany was neutral. Cuba under Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro in the early 60s, he had come to power. The Communist Party of Cuba was in power. They were neutral. North Korea was neutral. Some countries were neutral. They would do business with both sides. Che Guevara was neutral. He visited China, he visited North Korea, he also visited the Soviet Union, met with Khrushchev. Che Guevara, Cuba were neutral. A lot of the third world revolutionary and communist groups were neutral. However, Albania was 100% on China's side. And I mean, it was a pretty ugly split. For example, they cut diplomatic relations. And diplomatic relations were cut off. Chinese students were kicked out of the Soviet Union and sent back to China. A lot of engineers had been sent to China by the Soviet Union to build buildings, and they burned the blueprints and left buildings half built. And China lost a lot of aid. They'd been counting on a lot of Soviet aid to build up their country, and they lost it. And it was a pretty devastating split. And it was basically the Soviet Union wanted to tell the Chinese communists what to do, and the Chinese communists didn't want to hear it, right? Mao was a third world revolutionary. He was from a very poor country, China, that had fought to break out of imperialism. Mao's whole thing was, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. People that are oppressed and colonized have a right to fight for their freedom. And the leader of the Soviet Communist Party is saying, nope, peaceful coexistence, peaceful competition, peaceful transition. Mao wasn't going to accept that. And it was very insulting to China that the Soviet Union thought they could impose that political line, right? And Liu Shaoqi was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party who took the Soviet line, and he attempted a coup d'etat against Mao Zedong. There was an attempted coup against Mao by Liu Shaoqi, and Mao pushed out and defeated Liu Shaoqi, and China just was not going to accept the Soviet Union's line. And so China tried to, they took the position of like, well, the Soviet Union is watering down communism, and the Soviet Union was telling global communist, forces around the world to basically call off revolution in the name of appeasing the United States, in the name of détente and bogging down the Cold War. China, at first, their idea was they were going to be ultra-revolutionary, right? They were going to prove they were not revisionists like the USSR. They were going to be ultra-revolutionary. And so you had the Great Leap Forward in China, which was an attempt to build a fully socialist industrial economy very quickly, and it was not successful. And after the Great Leap Forward, you had the Cultural Revolution, and that's where the Little Red Book comes from. Originally, the book had been blue. Every Chinese soldier got a book as part of their, army equipment, part of their uniform. They got a book. It was originally blue, and it was quotations from Mao, and it had been compiled by Lin Biao, who was a top general in the Chinese army. And Lin Biao, one of Mao's top generals, who was the leader of the army, launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And that was an attempt to mobilize young people, primarily students and the military, to purge the Chinese Communist Party of revisionists and capitalist roaders. Right. And the idea was the Soviet Union had lost its way and was no longer revolutionary. They were revisionists. And so to make sure China stayed on the revolutionary road, all the young people were going to go out and the military was going to go out and they were going to bombard the headquarters. Right. The idea was, and drive out the capitalist roaders. Right. And that they had rhetoric against those who waved the red flag to oppose the red flag. Right. And that the Red Guard youth were mobilized in China. Young teenagers, 13, 14-year-old teenagers, went out and they were to purge the country of anything that was not communist. Right. If there was a movie theater, and it was called the King Movie Theater, they would go smash it and break the sign. And they'd say, now you're the communist movie theater because King, that's feudalism. Right. If you had a statue to an old god or an old religious practice, they would break it and destroy it. Right. And they raided people's homes. They destroyed ancient temples and ancient ruins. And the idea was they were the teenage Red Guards were going to purify China and make it pure communist. And that was the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution in China, it was like a little civil war almost. And it was basically the people in China that were aligned with Mao and Mao's wing of the Communist Party fighting against the Soviet-aligned wing of the Chinese Communist Party, the revisionist wing of the party, mobilizing all the teenagers and all the young people and the military to kind of purify China and make it purely communist. And it was chaos. And a lot of people got killed. And there was no structured legal system, so crazy things happened, right? And that, people were constantly being accused. There was a lot of public humiliation. If they accused you of being a revisionist or not being purely communist, you'd have to wear a sign around your head. I didn't follow the line, public humiliation. And to show you were sorry, you might have to walk on broken glass to as an apology or whatever. Really, it was kind of mob rule and chaos, the Cultural Revolution. But it was done with the intention of purifying the Chinese Communist Party line. And the leader of it was Lin Biao. Lin Biao was the leader of the Cultural Revolution. It was to purify China, to drive out the capitalist roaders, the revisionists, the rightists, whatever you called it. It was to purify the communist line. It was a bit of a disaster, but there were so many different interpretations. There were many different Red Guard factions. And in Shanghai, the Red Guards overthrew the Communist Party and they established the Shanghai Commune, like a workers' commune or something, modeled on the Paris Commune of 1871. the Shanghai Commune. And they established this kind of like, labor union, worker cooperative government that they established in Shanghai. And at that point, Mao condemned Lin Biao and condemned the Shanghai Commune. 1967. It was called the January Storm of 1967. The Red Guards seized Shanghai, declared it the Shanghai Commune. And at that point, Mao stepped in and said no and denounced the Cultural Revolution. And then Lin Biao suddenly started not appearing in politics. And Lin Biao, starting in 1967, you didn't see Lin Biao. Now, what happened later? 1969, Lin Biao, it was announced, had tried to overthrow Mao Zedong, had failed, and then he had fled to the Soviet Union. And so that morning, originally the Red Book had an introduction by Lin Biao. And so that morning, when it was announced that Lin Biao, the founder of the Cultural Revolution, tried to overthrow Mao, all the kids got their little red books and they got scissors and they snip, and they cut out his introduction. And Lin Biao was denounced as a traitor to Mao Zedong. And that was a turning point in the Cultural Revolution. The first half of the Cultural Revolution had been all the teenagers and the Red Guards going out and overthrowing the Communist Party leadership. But then Lin Biao had been overthrown. Now, before Lin Biao was overthrown, he gave a speech that was being widely circulated, which was called Long Live the Victory of the People's War. And it was a book that said that Mao's military strategy of seizing the countryside, building a peasant army in the countryside, surrounding the cities, and then invading the cities, applied to the world. And the third world was the global countryside, and the first world were the global cities. So the communists were first going to seize the countryside, and then they were going to invade America and the Western countries, right? And that you couldn't have a revolution in the first world. The first world would just have to be invaded by the third world. And that speech that Lin Biao gave, Long Live the Victory of People's War, said that the Soviet Union were revisionists and betrayers. That's what it said. It said they were revisionists. Right? They were not agreeing with communism, but that the third world revolution, the global countryside, would rise up. But after the fall of Lin Biao, you had the rise of the Gang of Four. That was Mao's wife and 3 other people. And they came into prominence. And the Gang of Four changed Chinese foreign policy. During the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, China had said that the Soviet Union were revisionists. They were selling out communism, and China were going to be the pure communists. But then, when the Gang of Four took power, they adopted a new phrase, Soviet social imperialism. And they said that the Soviet Union, they weren't just revisionists, they were imperialists. They had restored capitalism, and that they were another empire, just like U.S. imperialism. That's what they argued, right? That the Soviet Union was just another capitalist empire. They said that Khrushchev and his leaders of the Communist Party were what they called the state bourgeoisie, that they were exploiting the people of the Soviet Union, and they were building an empire, and that Soviet social imperialism and U.S. imperialism were 2 empires trying to control the world. Now, that was a big change. Originally, the critique of the Soviet Union was they weren't fighting U.S. imperialism hard enough. But then suddenly it became, well, they're just like U.S. imperialism. They're rival imperialists. And 1968, you had an anti-Soviet uprising in Czechoslovakia. Dubček, an anti-communist, anti-Russian leader of the Communist Party, took power. The Soviet Union intervened. You had the Prague Spring. China condemned the Soviet Union's intervention in Czechoslovakia. In 1969, the CIA sends forces to Angola to fight against the MPLA. The Angolan African people are fighting against Portugal, which is their colonizer, led by the MPLA, the Movement for the Liberation of the People of Angola, the communist fighting force, right? So the CIA is sending people to train the Portuguese military to fight the Angolans. Well, China sends its military forces to Angola to fight alongside a breakaway from the MPLA called UNITA, which claims to be a Maoist communist group, but it's being armed and given guns by the CIA, and it's working with the Portuguese, the colonizer, to fight against the MPLA. They say the MPLA are puppets of the Soviet Union, and the MPLA is the Movement for the Liberation of the People of Angola. Well, UNITA is the Union for the total liberation of Angola. Like, they want to liberate Angola not just from Portuguese colonialism, but from Soviet social imperialism. And the leader of UNITA is a guy named Jonas Savimbi, who was a literal cannibal. Not a nice guy, Jonas Savimbi. You read about Jonas Savimbi, pretty nasty motherfucker. Practiced witchcraft, literally ate people, like a Jeffrey Dahmer type guy, like a pretty bloodthirsty, nasty motherfucker. And he was being armed by the CIA, but he was calling himself a Maoist communist, and China sent him guns and weapons because he was fighting the Soviet social imperialists. Eventually, Jonas Savimbi denounced communism and just became an adherent he said he was a Christian and an adherent of Western democracy. And he actually met with Ronald Reagan, even though he was a cannibal. I mean, you can't make this up, right? But Jonas Savimbi, nasty guy, backed by the United States to fight against communism in Angola. But, China for a while supported him when he was claiming he was a Maoist communist. And that all over the world, China started aligning with countries that were opposing the Soviet Union, often, U.S.-backed regimes. For example, China embraced Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, when Salvador Allende, the socialist, was overthrown by the CIA in 1973, and Pinochet became the military dictator of Chile. The CIA supported him, and China also supported him because he was fighting Soviet social imperialism. The Shah of Iran, right, was a brutal dictator backed by the United States, but he was fighting against the Soviet Union, so they liked him. And that Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, he was fighting against the Soviet Union, and he was welcomed by Mao to China and all of that. And that China started aligning itself with the United States. And they said that at first they came out with what they called the theory of three worlds. The theory of three worlds was the idea that, they said the first world were the imperialist countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. The second world was Europe. And that the third world, the oppressed, colonized countries of the world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that was going to be led by China. And they said there would be a nuclear war, and there would be World War III was inevitable, and the USA and the Soviet Union were going to go to war, and 2/3 of humanity would probably die. But the third world would be all that was left, and then China would rule the third world. It was a pretty dark apocalyptic scenario that they had, the theory of three worlds. And then they declared that Soviet social imperialism was the main danger to the people of the world. So, that U.S. imperialism was not as dangerous as Soviet imperialism was. And that was the Chinese position. And eventually Mao died. And after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came into power. And Deng Xiaoping, continued these politics, but he was implementing market reforms, right? He was, he arrested the Gang of Four. He declared the Cultural Revolution was over, and he was implementing market reforms. So all over the world, you have these new communist parties that are taking direction from China. And they had originally supported China because China was more critical of the United States. They saw the Soviet Union as accommodating the United States. They saw de-Stalinization as selling out the principles of communism. And so they had formed these new parties because they wanted to support the Vietnamese. They wanted to support, anti-colonialism. They wanted to defend Stalin's legacy, etc. But then in the 70s, China started pivoting toward aligning with the United States. So this was all very confusing. Now, in America, I've written about the new communist movement, and that was in the 1970s. A lot of these groups that were inspired by China formed new communist parties, tried to recruit their co-workers. And I've studied this in depth, and I've met these people, and I've read the archives, and, read it. I mean, this is my book on the new communist movement. It's a well-researched piece, but, a lot of these communist groups that were taking inspiration from China were completely confused because these people had become communists protesting the U.S. war in Vietnam. They become communists protesting against U.S. imperialism. And suddenly China was saying, well, the main threat is the Soviet Union. It was very confusing. And all of this was very confusing. But still to this day, there are a number of political parties that trace their roots back to this. And this is why all of this is important, right? There are a number of communist groups in America, in Europe, that are anti-revisionist communist groups, meaning they denounce Khrushchev. They like Stalin, and they think that after Stalin, the Soviet Union lost its way. And some of them are Mao aligned, and they follow Mao in China. Some of them were Albania aligned. Some of them were only pro-Stalin and didn't really care about Albania or China. But they are communist groups that are trying to hold on to Stalin's political line, right? And what's interesting is it's kind of like Protestants, right? In America, in Christianity, you have Orthodox Christians, you got Catholics, and you got Protestants. But Protestants, they're not Catholic, they're not Orthodox, they're Protestant. But Protestants divide into two very, very, very different groups. You have mainline Protestants and evangelical Protestants. And they're both Protestant, but they interpret it in wildly different ways, okay? For example, there are anti-revisionists like the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, like the Workers' Party of Belgium, that they're anti-revisionist in the sense that they are opposing U.S. imperialism. They want the global communist movement to be more anti-imperialist. They're trying to hold on to anti-imperialism, and they're trying to defend Stalin's legacy, right? That's one wing of anti-revisionism. And you have another wing of anti-revisionism that says that, the Soviet Union was revisionist and lost its way. China has lost its way. And that in the name of like holding on to the legacy of what Stalin was doing, they want this super, super pure form of communism that doesn't exist anywhere in the world and is based on their unique interpretation. The Revolutionary Communist Party of the United States says that there is not a single communist country in the world, and that Bob Avakian, their new leader, is the inheritor of Stalin and Mao and has this new synthesis, this new unique interpretation. There are a lot of communist groups around the world that are rooted in anti-revisionism that maintain the Soviet Union sold out with Khrushchev, China sold out after Mao died, and nowhere in the world is communist anymore. And we have our special, unique kind of communism. They're like ultra sectarian communist groups. And that's interesting as well. And they both come out of anti-revisionism, and they're completely opposite in their interpretation, right? The Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, and the Workers' Party of Belgium, those groups love all the communist governments. They love China, they love Vietnam, they love Cuba, and their position is they want to go back to Stalin, and they want to go back to anti-imperialism and all that. But then you have groups like the Revolutionary Communist Party of the United States, or Red Dawn, I think it's called Rota Morgen in Germany, or the MLPD, the Marxist-Leninist Party of Germany, or the RCPB-ML in Britain, the Revolutionary Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, and so you have some of these anti-revisionists that are like wildly sectarian, and believe no one in the world is communist, and that they have the one true interpretation. They are the inheritors of Stalin and Mao's legacy. In some cases, only Stalin's legacy. In some cases, Stalin and Albania and Verhoj's legacy. And then you have some of these groups that, support all the anti-imperialist countries and think Stalin was like the most pure communist or whatever. But that's called anti-revisionism. And it's an important trend in global communism because there's one wing of anti-revisionism that is the wing that is solidly anti-imperialist. I mean, that's why I knew Harpal Brar when I was in high school. I knew of him because he was an anti-revisionist who was really outspoken in defending the Soviet Union's legacy, in opposing the U.S. war in Iraq, in defending China and all that. And so Harpal Brar and the CPGBML, I knew about them because they were a leading anti-imperialist voice. And, I was in the Workers' World Party for many years. Workers' World Party had Trotskyist roots, but they were always going to anti-revisionist conferences around the world because the anti-revisionists were the ones defending China, defending Russia, and, opposing U.S. imperialism. And so anti-revisionism is a wing of communism that basically views what Khrushchev did and de-Stalinization in a negative light. That's basically what it is. And I mean, it is a wing of global communism. There are anti-revisionists that are pretty solid anti-imperialists, and there are anti-revisionists that are wacky, like the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Bobovakian people, like the, that are wildly sectarian. And it's an interesting development. And, communism, at this point, I would say Marxism, Leninism, communism divides into three categories. Mainline communists, the official communist parties, the Communist Party USA, led by Joe Sims, the Communist Party of Canada, just like the official communist parties. Those are what you call the mainline communists. And most of those parties have completely, the Communist Party of France denounced the Soviet Union as just kind of a liberal party. They're just part of the French government. The Japanese Communist Party has cut ties with China, cut ties with North Korea. They're just like a liberal party, but historically they go back to being the Soviet aligned party. Those are the mainline communist parties. They're usually pretty fucking lame. I hate to say it. They're usually, at this point, they're big, and they have a lot of money because they've been around for a long time, and they were at one point the Soviet aligned party, but a lot of them have become very stale and institutional, and a lot of them have really completely denounced, especially in Europe, like the Communist Party of Britain, the CPB, and the Communist Party of France, the Italian Communist Party liquidated and dissolved. It's now called the Democratic Left Party. It's not even a communist party, right? The Communist Party of Canada. These groups are pretty lame, but their legacy goes back to being communist parties. Then you have Trotskyites, the people who opposed Stalin and followed Trotsky, the theory of permanent revolution. Right. And there's a million little Trotskyite groups, right? And they reject Stalin. They reject the Soviet Union. Generally, they don't support socialist countries, though sometimes they'll support Cuba, or sometimes they'll kind of support them, but denounce their governments, or, whatever. You have Trotskyites. I've talked a lot about Trotskyism on these streams. And then you have anti-revisionism, which is people that were embracing, the people that opposed Khrushchev, defending Stalin against Khrushchev, embracing China and their criticisms of Khrushchev, embracing Albania, their criticisms of the Soviet Union. You have anti-revisionist groups. Maoists, Hojists, or just general anti-revisionists. Those are the three kind of schools of Marxism, Leninism that you see around the world. Mainliners, Trotskyites, and anti-revisionists. In America, the main group is the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP. They're the biggest anti-revisionist group. They used to have a lot of bookstores. Their leader, Bobovakian, lived in exile in France for many years. They're doing the, refuse fascism protests against Donald Trump right now. They sell their newspaper, and they were like the most visible communist group for a long time. I mean, you'll see them if you go to protests or whatever. You'll see them if you're in a major city. They exist, right? They're a Maoist group, an anti-revisionist group. There's a couple other groups. There's a group called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, FRSO. Freedom Road. People call them Friso, Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They have a website, a really nice website, and they recruit a lot of young people, but they're very secretive. Basically, you join them and you get to be part of a book club, and it's like a super secret book club, and you hide your cell phone and you meet with them, and you read communist books and you argue with them about Stalin and Mao and stuff like that. But they orient you to get a job at a liberal NGO, to get a job at a labor union or a Democratic Party activist group or Planned Parenthood or something like that, and then secretly maneuver within the group. And it's really stupid, but that's what they orient their people to do. It's basically a book club. You can be a liberal activist for the Democrats, and still pretend you're a communist because you're in this secret club. called Freedom Road, and you have your secret party name, and you get together and, read books, and you get to pretend you're doing some kind of revolutionary work, and you're not, right? There are a lot of NGOs. And this is where it's very interesting, especially like in Chinatown in New York City, in Oakland, California. There's a lot of like liberal activist groups that were at one point anti-revisionist communist groups. Right? There's in New York City in Chinatown, there's a building that's it's owned by a group called the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, CAV. And they were one of the only buildings that had electricity during Hurricane Sandy because they have a generator and their own generator. And they're an Asian American activist group. Years ago, they were associated with something called the Communist Workers' Party. But the Communist Workers' Party dissolved, and they're just kind of a liberal activist group. And I think probably some of the older people in the group, if you ask them, they still consider themselves to be communists. They might have a picture of Mao in their house. But most of the people there, it's just a community activist liberal group, right? Margaret Chin, who's on the New York City Council, was a leader of the Communist Workers' Party at one point. She's a Chinese American, and she supports Israel. She's just a regular Democrat, but at one point, she was an anti-revisionist. She was a Maoist communist. There's something called the League of Revolutionaries for a New America, LRNA, League of Revolutionaries for a New America. And they have what's called the National Coalition for the Homeless. And they have a lot of, they have the People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. They have a lot of like liberal groups that help people get food stamps, right? They have offices. You'll go there if you're, low income, and they'll help you file for your food stamps in a way that you're guaranteed to get, get the maximum benefits, right? And again, are they communists? I mean, you would never know that if you went to the office of the Welfare Rights Union of Detroit or the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign or but if you talk to some of the older people that run these liberal NGOs that get funding from George Soros, some of the older people will tell you, yeah, we're communists and we're in this group called League of Revolutionaries for a New America that has this new theory of the precariat. And, and there's a lot of that, of like, a lot of anti-revisionist groups have set up kind of community activist groups, right, that do work. It's usually not among white people. I will just tell you, it's usually among Black or Latino or Asian folks. It's some kind of ethnic kind of thing. They have some kind of community empowerment group, community activist group that does not look communist and isn't really communist. It's just liberal. It's just Democratic Party community. They register people to vote for the local Democrat. They apply for money from like liberal foundations. But the older people, the boomers that are in charge of it, that set it up, if you talk to them, if you get to know them, they'll tell you that they like Mao or they like Stalin or whatever. But they, and there's a lot of that, like wreckage, leftovers from anti-revisionist groups. There's a group called the Provisional Communist Party. It's very secretive. They don't have a website or anything like that. But they have the United Farm Workers of America, or no, was it the Eastern Farm Workers Association and the California Homemakers Association. They have these kind of like charity groups that like give sandwiches out to low income like day laborers and stuff, and they like do like kind of charity work, giving sandwiches to poor people and stuff like that. And if you really get to know them, secretly they'll tell you, yeah, we're actually Maoist communists and we follow, I think their leader was a guy, Gino Parente, and you can read about them. They're very secretive, and they're widely accused of being a cult. There's like the Cult Awareness Network like stalks them, and I think they're big in Alaska and they're big in secret, and I think the National Labor Federation, NATLFed, is, and they operate a group of like, they're just kind of like liberal activists who go to labor union rallies. They do, they give sandwiches away and stuff. And they're very secretive, but if you really get to know them, they'll tell you, actually, we're this communist group, but they don't want you to know that. And there's a lot of that, right? And it's interesting. A lot of these groups, some of them are no longer communist. They're just kind of liberal activist community groups. And some of them are still communist, but secretly, right? But give it a few decades, they won't be communist anymore. It's just kind of like part of being anti-revisionist communist was setting up these like labor union activist groups. And the idea was, that was going to be how communists would like secretly take over the labor movement or secretly influence the community. And then what they did just kind of became an end unto itself, right? It stopped being about the goal, and it's actually revisionism, right? It's the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, that's one wing of communism. You got your mainline communist parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, the Third International, Comintern. You got your Trotskyites, and you've got anti-revisionists. And this is something a lot of people don't know about. Again, if you really want to deep dive into, the new communist movement, read my book on the new communist movement. I did a lot of research. I pulled from a lot of different sources. In the 70s, there were a lot of people who really did spend the whole of their lives trying to build a new communist party aligned with China. And there's a lot you can learn from this period. So I encourage people to check out this little pamphlet I wrote, The New Communist Movement, Party Building in 1970s America. But yeah, that's my little wrap tonight. It's esoteric politics. That's what I called this. I mean, so there you go. If you're curious about, anti-revisionist groups. All right. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. And from there, we will start answering questions. So names and locations. We got Kit from HLM. All right. Great. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. We got Orange County, California, Ryan in Kansas City, Kurt from Albania, Gabby from Chicago, Lawrence Johnson from Chicago, B.A. Baracus, J.D. in Canada, SLUC, Utah, California, Charles in Brooklyn, Jenny in Cincinnati, RSFO in Copenhagen, Denmark, Maria in Wyoming, Patch in Arizona, Red Axes in Ottawa, Ian in Yukon, Kim in Ontario, yay, John in Florida. Names and locations. St. David's, Bermuda. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Waka, waka, waka. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Al in Sydney, Australia. Good to see you, good to see you, good to see you. Names and locations. Kieran in London. Good to see you. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Look, if you've got a question for the second half of the show, all you need to do is send me a Rumble rant, a Cash App. But the best way, the absolute best way to send your question is to buy me a coffee. Buy me a coffee is perfect. You can... There's no word limit. You can send in what you want. It's just the best thing to do is buy me a coffee. Few people have already done it, and I'll be answering their questions shortly. Bill from Tasmania, very good. But yeah, buy me a coffee is the best way to send your questions, right? Rose, good to see you, Rose. But yeah, buy me a coffee is the best way to send your questions. Now, we're going to have a great event in New Jersey on January 11th. It's going to be very awesome. Hope to see you all there. It's going to be good. It's going to be great. Register for the event, please, if you're coming, so we know you're coming. And we have your information and such. Register for our January event. It's going to be very, very excellent. I'm very pumped and excited for the event. Going to be very good. Going to be great. Be there, be there, be there. Go ahead and register. It's going to be good. Send in, go buy me a coffee if you got a question. And, yeah, I'm going to put on some anti-revisionist music, just because that's what we're talking about tonight. I'm going to put on Cornelius Cardew was an experimental composer in Britain, and he adopted anti-revisionist politics, and he wrote songs that had anti-revisionist Marxist meaning. So this is Fight the Cuts by Cornelius Cardew, his song about fighting against cuts in government spending and social services. Maybe it's particularly relevant in light of the government shutdown. Here we go.
Terminology, capitalist, lackey government, Let's finance have its way to increase their rate of profit. They make the workers pay. Fight the cuts, that's part and parcel of our class strategy. In proletarian revolution, we owned our destiny. Beware left snakes in our back pockets, false champions of our fight. Their interest is to stop class struggle and maintain capital's might. Fight the cuts, that's part and parcel of our class strategy. In proletarian revolution, we owned our destiny. The working class, it is the greatest class in history. It can and must unite all forces to win victory. Fight the cuts, that's part and parcel of our class strategy. In proletarian revolution, we owned our destiny. Fight the cuts, that's part and parcel of our class strategy. In proletarian revolution, we owned our destiny.
All righty. So we've got 2 questions via Buy Me a Coffee, and then Penny sent a video via Rumble Rant. So we will get around to that. Again, anyone who's got any questions, anything they want me to reply to, by all means, Buy Me a Coffee is the best way. Go and buy me a coffee is the best way to do it. Great things are happening. I'm quite excited about everything that's happening. Academic Agent, my interview with Academic Agent went very well. I think that went well. People are scooping up my books in big numbers right now. And, we're building for this big event in January. And we just had a great check-in. I mean, there was a number of people. Usually our Wednesday night check-ins for CPI are quite small. It's just, whoever happens to be available, it's maybe 10 people at the most or whatever. We had a huge one tonight. It was big, and our meetings are getting bigger. Our membership is being activated. Our outreach is happening. Yeah, it's happening. So I'm really excited about building our organization, but I got to prepare, right? Giving a big talk in January, and we're honoring some great people. And, we're building a real anti-imperialist movement, and I am very happy about it. Very, very happy about it. All right. So we're going to start answering questions. All right. Richard says, thoughts on the H-1B controversy. I don't know how it gets controversial. They're all here legally. Staying out of trouble. Hell of some of it seems driven by racism. I mean, the Nazi Kosh Patel is suing, called Hindus demon worshippers. Okay, so my position on the H-1 visa is that right now, they're right. The people that are critical of it are right. It would be better if we had our own engineers, our own scientists, our own doctors, and all of that, but we don't, right? We don't train our own people. Brain drain is a lose-lose. It's a lose for America, and it's a lose for the developing world. Starting in the Cold War, we figured out that a great way to fight the commies and just fight the third world in general was to strip them of their smart people, right? And we figured out that, if, we want to weaken the communist countries, get all their doctors to move to New Jersey or Idaho, and get all the doctors from Moscow to move to New Jersey or Idaho and have them make more money, and then they won't have any doctors in the communist country. right? And this started applying to the third world. And a lot of countries like India, a lot of countries like Russia, a lot of countries like China spend a lot of money to educate their people. And then America pulls them away and pays them more money. And we don't educate our own people. American education is shitty. That's okay. We can just import all our smart people. We don't churn out engineers. We don't churn out scientists. Our schools absolutely suck. That's fine. We can just depend on India and Nigeria and, Eastern Europe and wherever. We can depend on them to educate their people. And then we'll just take those people away. That's why the Berlin Wall was put up. It was to keep the people there. Most people didn't want to leave East Germany, but the engineers, the scientists, the doctors did, because America was trying to pull them away. And so, they built a picket line. It was a picket line basically to prevent, people who got their education from, and it's bad for America because we don't educate our people, and it's bad for the developing world because they don't have it. And it sucks, but we can't just declare it over, right? We can't just stop bringing in skilled people from around the world. We need to gradually transition to educating our own people again. We need a government that invests in communities. But the problem with just, the whole, I saw Nick Fuentes did this whole thing. He's against, you can't just declare it over, right? I mean, we're not churning out the engineers we need. And we don't get them by just cutting off these people's visas, right? That they don't just magically appear the second we stop giving visas to people in India. So yes, I would like to eventually transition toward a country where we don't need to bring in foreign engineers and foreign doctors and stuff like that. Unfortunately, right now, because of the Cold War and imperialism and a lot of shitty stuff that has really fucked over Americans and the developing world, we can't do anything about it. I mean, so, the controversy is kind of manufactured, right? At this point, we're kind of in a situation where we have to bring in foreign skilled professionals, but I would like us to not be in that situation. As far as the racism thing, that is interesting to me. So, for reasons I won't get into, for a while, I was watching, there's a church in Queens that is largely people of Indian descent that are Christians. And I was watching them on the internet. I visited them a couple times, and I would listen to the sermons that this woman who was their pastor would give. And she is herself of like Indian and Caribbean descent. Woo, sometimes the anti-Hinduism that she would give off, I was shocked. I mean, my goodness, if I talked that way, I mean, she would be on there, she'd be like praying, she'd begin her church, and she'd be like, "Dear God, thank you for you. If it wasn't for you, I'd be worshiping a cow. If it wasn't for you, I'd be worshiping a giant elephant. Oh my God." And it was like stuff that was like really anti-Hindu. I was shocked. Like, it was stuff that if I said it to, like somebody of Hindu descent, I would be like being racist, right? But I guess Hinduism and Christianity are so opposed, right? That Indian Christians are persecuted by the Modi government, that they mainly persecute Muslims, right? Muslims are the main enemies of Hinduism in India, but there is persecution of Christians. And, every so often and these were folks of Indian descent. So I guess they have the right. I mean, but religious bigotry of any kind doesn't sit right with me. I mean, you're allowed to think your religion's right and another religion's wrong. But I mean, every so often this church full of people of Indian descent would just, the stuff that they would say about Hinduism, it was really nasty, right? Thank God I'm not a bride burner. Thank God I'm not from that bride burning cult that my grandparents believed in. I found you, Jesus. Like, gee, I mean, like, gosh, my God, there's no reason to talk that nasty, it was like really, really intense stuff. And that surprised me. And I guess if you are a Christian or a Muslim from India, there is a lot of hatred for Hindus, and Hindu nationalists are particularly mad at Muslim. Modi has a record of being quite anti-Islamic, and a lot of Hindus are very pro-Israel because they hate Muslims. So there's an ethnic component to this that we don't understand. And there are different ethnic groups in India, okay? Right? There are different ethnic groups. There's Sikhism, which is a whole nother thing, right? Sikhism is it's, I guess it has roots in Hinduism, but it's a breakaway, right? It's a complete breakaway, Sikhism. So, this is stuff that we can't really relate to, okay? But, when you're talking about, racism and, calling Hindus devil worshippers and stuff, if white Christians do that, white European people do that, they're being racist. People in that part of the world do it, it's related to ethnic stuff that's, it's not the same, right? If I were to see an Indian person practicing their religion and I said, oh, you're a devil worshiper, or you go worship, I'd be being racist, right? I'd be being an asshole racist. If I was another Indian person who's from another religious group and there's long-standing rivalry, I'm not saying it's okay, but it's different, okay? And that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's all I want to say about that, right? I'm against all forms of religious bigotry. And Tulsi Gabbard, who I really look up to, she is Hindu, right? She is a Hindu. She follows science of identity, which is a split from the Krishna movement. And from what I understand, again, I don't understand any of this, right? So you're talking to somebody who I have I really don't understand this, but from the way it's been explained to me, the Hare Krishna movement is a kind of monotheistic interpretation of Hinduism. Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. But they also believe that all that exists is one substance, right? That all that exists is one substance. And that the Hare Krishna movement is an interpretation of the Krishna faith that argues that there is only one God, because we're all part of that God, and there's only one substance in the universe, and emphasizes, almost sounds monotheistic. So, and Tulsi Gabbard does not talk about gods, she talks about God, right? And that the Hare Krishna movement sounds very monotheistic, even though it comes out of Hinduism. Though most Hindus worship different deities, technically Hindus believe they are all just different faces, and that all that exists is just all that is spiritual, and all that is matter is just a reflection of one substance, right? That's a big part of Hinduism. But most Hindus believe in multiple deities, but there are certain interpretations of Hinduism that sound very monotheistic. It's interesting, Charles, you mentioned Indian MAGA. There are a lot of Modi supporting Indians who love Trump, because they see Trump as, Modi is in the BRICS, and Modi is, it's complicated. Modi is definitely got a bone to pick with China, but, Modi is independent. India has its own economy, and it's a complicated situation. So I hope that's helpful, Richard. Now, Gavin asked a very good question, and it's actually from Paul. Okay. Hey, Caleb, what are your sources on the Trots in Spain? Is the first part of it. Right. So go and read anything by Spanish communists. Dolores Iburo, right? She's the one who coined the term, the slogan, "They shall not pass." She has an autobiography that goes into great detail about it, but just read about the Battle of Catalonia. That was a violent uprising led by Trotskyites and anarchists against the Spanish Republic. And as far as Trotskyists opposing the Popular Front, go and read Trotsky's writings. What Trotsky argued was that that Stalin had deviated from Leninism, that Lenin believed in the united front was the Leninist policy, which is a unity of the working class. And that first, in the first period of Stalin's leadership, after the Sixth World Congress, that Stalin had engaged in ultra-leftism and had focused on attacking Trotskyites focused on attacking social democrats and reformist labor leaders, and focused on dividing the working class movement, right? And fighting within the working class, engaged in ultra-leftism instead of building a workers' united front, which was the Leninist policy. And then during the Popular Front, Trotsky said that Stalin was having an alliance with members of the capitalist class that were against fascism. And Trotsky was for unity of the working class, all the working class organizations, but not with any capitalists. So he wasn't for an alliance with any of the capitalist class. He didn't believe there was a democratic bourgeoisie and a fascist bourgeoisie. He argued that there was the working class, and he was for working class political independence. And he considered the Popular Front policies to be a betrayal. That is generally because Trotsky emphasized independent working class action. That's the Trotskyite line generally. I don't agree with that. And I think the Popular Front was correct. And I also think the third period was correct, that I believe in the early 1930s, social democrats were the main danger. And after that, fascism became the main danger. And that Trotsky, Trotskyism is largely based on this premise that what Lenin and the Bolsheviks did in July of 1917 is what you should do at all times, under all circumstances. And that if you just keep doing that, the magical moment will arise and it'll work. That's generally what Trotskyite groups believe. If you talk to them, it's almost like, imagine that there's a door and that door is unlocked for 1 minute every day, and you don't know what minute that will be. So you just stand at the door, turning the knob, trying to open it, because you never know. At some point, it'll be that minute in the day when it'll actually work and you can go through it. That's what Trotskyites believe. That if we just follow the rules, they have kind of a very, very strict set of rules. And if we follow these rules, we never align with any capitalists. We build a strict democratic centralist organization. We uphold the permanent revolution. We united front policy. We're for the independence of the working class. It's a really long list of rules. If we just follow this esoteric list of rules, the moment will arise where it'll all just work. And that's what they believe. And that's what Trotskyites, a lot of the groups have never accomplished anything, especially the more sectarian Orthodox Trotskyist groups. They have absolutely no base. They're just obscure groups of intellectuals. And if you talk to them, that's fine, because, it's not the right moment yet. But their whole big thing is that if you deviate from those rules, that very complicated set of rules, if you deviate from that very complicated set of rules, when the moment arises, you won't take power. You won't win, right? That's Trotskyism. And it's that, Trotsky's writings in the 1930s, which I've got here. I read, I started reading them. Trotsky's, I was in the Workers' World Party, which claimed to be the true inheritors of this. And I've got, Trotsky, 1934, 1935, 1932. I would read these books, right? 1935. It's all of Trotsky's essays in exile when he's critiquing the Comintern line. And that was his thing. He was for the united front against the Popular Front and against sectarianism, right? And he called the third period, the early period of the Stalin years, sectarian, and then, or ultra left, the third period. And then he called it the Popular Front period reformist, and it was abandoning the Leninist concept of the united front, right? That Lenin had directed, he'd written left-wing communism, and he'd put forward the concept of the united front, and that the united front, according to Trotsky, which, he may be right. He's not wrong. It's what Lenin said, right? But there's nothing that says that's a permanent tactic for all situations. But Lenin's concept was, after the Russian Revolution, right? If you read Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, and you read the early stuff of the Communist International, Lenin was telling the communists to form united fronts. And the idea of the united front was that working class organizations would come together and be brought together around demands like an 8-hour workday, free political prisoners, etc. No capitalists would be part of it, but they would try to get all the working class movement, the labor unions, the anarchists, all the working class movement to mobilize in united fronts around certain demands, right? And that would move toward the working class establishing political independence from the capitalist class and move toward taking power. That was the concept of the united front. Now, Stalin developed what he called the united front from below, right? And that's when Stalin, so 1928 is when Stalin solidified his power. You had the Sixth World Congress. And at the Sixth World Congress, they advocated the united front from below, meaning that they said they didn't want alliance with the Social Democrats anymore because the Social Democrats were class traitors, but they wanted to go to the workers from below. So the communists built, the mass unemployment organizations, and they built, labor unions, and, and they organized the unorganized workers who the AFL wouldn't organize, the miners and the sharecroppers in the South. And the idea was, we don't want a united front from above with the leaders of the labor bureaucracy, with the Social Democrats. We want a united front from below. And that's where they called the Social Democrats social fascists. And they said the Social Democrats were the main danger. That was the third period. The early 1930s. Then you had the Seventh World Congress, where Georgy Dimitrov composed his text on the United Front Against Fascism. But Dimitrov was saying we need to unite with capitalists. We need to unite with the democratic bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is divided between the fascist bourgeoisie and the democratic bourgeoisie. And that we can unite with the democratic bourgeoisie. And because capitalism is naturally moving toward fascism, because of the economics of capitalism, we will be the leaders of the anti-fascist movement. And that was the Popular Front, was the idea. It's not a united front, which is just the working class. It's a popular front, right? The Popular Front it includes democratic bourgeoisie. It includes all class elements that are against fascism. So that's the idea. Trotsky thought the Popular Front was a betrayal. And in Spain, if you read Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell went to Spain and he fought with the Trotskyites against the Spanish Republic. And if you read Homage to Catalonia, it maintains that the communists were suppressing independent workers' revolution by supporting the Spanish Republic. And it argues that the seizure of Catalonia by the Trotskyites and anarchists was justified because the only way to defeat fascism was to unleash true workers' power from below, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's what the fifth column was. The fifth column was the people that were undermining the Spanish Republic from the left, and that they were being supported by Hitler and by fascism, right? And that's pretty well established. And if you read anything from Spanish communists, they talk about this. And I believe Grover Furr has done some work on this, because one thing that is now claimed is that the KGB was all over Spain killing Trotskyites. That is a widespread claim. There is absolutely no evidence for that. The idea that KGB were running around all over Spain assassinating, that wasn't happening. And Grover shows there's no evidence of that whatsoever. The Spanish government the Spanish Republic was going after them because they were trying to overthrow it and were getting money from the fascists to do it. But the idea that the Soviet Union, Stalin sent a bunch of KGB men into Spain and they were going rounding up, George Orwell and his friends or something, that's not true, right? And Grover Furr has written some on that there are people who claim the Soviet archives say that happened, and that's false. And I would recommend some of that, but it's not just Grover Furr. I mean, it's widely understood that the very concept of the fifth column comes out of this, and it's well documented that Italy and Germany were supporting the POUM, the POUM, which was the Trotskyite group in Spain, as well as the anarchist group in their efforts to undermine the Spanish Republic from the left. That's pretty well documented. And again, I would read the biography of the leader of the Spanish Communist Party, Dolores Iborra, and go read her stuff. Go read, the memoirs written by people who fought in Spain. There's a lot of Americans who fought in Spain for the Republic, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Go read their autobiographies. They all talk about this, how they're on the one hand, they're fighting the fascists, and then they're on the back, they're fighting the Trotskyites. And, so yeah, you can read all about it. There we go. And shout out to our friend Garland Nixon, who's in Belarus right now. Garland is awesome. He's over there, and he and Scott are doing great work. I can't wait to interview him when he comes back. Kim in Ontario asks, I was probably a typical North American. I learned nothing about communism, especially not in school and any major seriously, knew nothing until my early 20s. How were you introduced? Family, maybe raised in a major city, especially to be in high school. Well, Kim, I'll tell you my story, right? And I've told this many times on these streams, but if you want to know my background, I was a kid in a small town in Ohio. I'm from a little tiny town in Ohio. It was 10,000 people when I grew up there. Now it's down to like 6,000 people. It's called Orville. It's where they make Smucker's jelly. If you ever had Smucker's jelly, that's made in my hometown in Orville, Ohio. That's where I grew up. And it was a very conservative Republican area, a lot of Mennonites, a lot of, German folks. My family are Irish American, but my mother is very religious. My father, not as much, but my family were like Democrats. My parents both had master's degrees. They're college educated, and they were Democrats. Almost everyone in my town was a Republican, but my family were like liberals, kind of small town liberals. They were, the kind of people you find in college towns and all of that. When I was a kid, everyone just told me communism, I would start asking questions about world events. And they would say, well, that's communism. And I would be like, what's communism? It was like communism. Everything in America in politics got back to, there was this bad thing called communism. And, if you ever brought up, why don't we just give people health care? Well, that's communism. You can't do that. Oh, okay. Right. Why don't we just give a job? Why don't we utilize, why should anyone be unemployed? If someone's is able to work, why shouldn't they be employed? And we put them to work doing something useful. That's communism. So communism was just this thing. And what everybody knew was that communism had just failed everywhere it had ever been tried. There's never anywhere had communism ever worked. It had just been a complete failure. And that's what everybody knew, right? Communism, every country that had ever had communism had all been poor and starving and miserable, and it just failed everywhere, and it was a brutal dictatorship and all this. And so, but the other thing was that, and I haven't talked about this as much, but I started to, as I learned what communism was, I started to realize that the teachings of Jesus in the Bible and communism had a lot in common, right? And that there was a lot of what Jesus was saying about the last should be first and the first shall be last. And, the disciples held all things in common, and, I was hungry and you fed me. I was homeless and you housed me. I was naked and you clothed me. And what you did unto the least of these, you did unto me. And all this, it seemed a lot like communism. And I remember saying that, right? And, and all that. And so I was like mildly interested in communism and all of that. And I got interested, and I learned that there were different kinds of communism, democratic socialism and anarchism. And I realized that I got on the internet was a very new thing. And I remember when I discovered there was a communist party in America, I was like, wow, I didn't even know that. Right. And so I remember I went to the library and I thought, well, I'm going to learn about Trotsky because Stalin killed Trotsky. So maybe Trotsky was like a good communist that wasn't like this bad kind. So I got Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed. It's got a name, The Revolution Betrayed. Where is the Soviet Union and what is it? What is the Soviet Union? Where is it going? So it's supposed to be an anti-Soviet, The Revolution Betrayed. The first chapter of that book is called What Has Been Achieved. And it's all statistics about how much steel they were producing, about how much wheat they were growing, about the power plants they were building, how they'd electrified the country. And I read this and I was like, this can't be true, because everybody knows that communism just failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And everyone is poor, and it just can't be true. This can't be the truth. And so I checked the statistics, and I went to the library, and I got the World Book Encyclopedia, the section on the Soviet Union, Soviet economy. And I read it, and I was like blown away, because it was true. The Soviet Union had raised the country up and had industrialized, had invented space travel, had wiped out illiteracy. And even I checked, the U.S. country studies, right, from the U.S. Library of Congress. Romania had huge achievements, and Czechoslovakia, and North Korea, and like all the communist countries had industrialized. And I remember in my family, we hosted a student from Bulgaria. We were part of a program at one of the local colleges where we hosted foreign students. There was a guy from Bulgaria who was just a college student who was studying. And I remember, he had, been born when it was still a communist country before the fall or whatever. And I remember I asked him, is there anyone in Bulgaria who still believes in communism? And he said, yeah, my grandfather. And I said, your grandfather? And he said, yeah. Because his grandfather had, after the Second World War, Bulgaria didn't have any paved roads. And so the communists had gotten all the young men together and mobilized them to pave the roads of the country. And he'd gone from city to city with all the other young men working hard, paving the roads of Bulgaria. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences he'd ever had. The war was devastating, but it was over. And all the young people of the country were working really hard to pave roads so they could have a new, strong country. And he said his grandfather had been through that, had built the roads of Bulgaria when he was like a young man. And he said his grandfather had been the best experience of his life, and that until the day his grandfather died, his grandfather was a defender of Stalin, a defender of the Soviet Union, because he remembered when Bulgaria didn't have any roads and how the communists came and mobilized the people to build the roads. I thought that's a neat story. That's amazing, right? And I assumed that anyone who lived under communism would say it was awful, was hell on earth. But he was saying, well, actually, in Bulgaria, the people who believed in communism were the old people, were the elderly who could remember it. And I thought, well, that doesn't match. And then I found out that all the formerly communist countries, the polls show that people say life was better before. And it was like, I realized I'd been lied to. And that American political discourse is founded on lies, right? And it's actually taken me years. I've realized that there's a reason that the communist countries have market reforms, and that, that Deng Xiaoping theory is necessary. And that, for a long time, I believed if we just went back to the Stalin way of doing things, because I was just so angry I'd been lied to, and I was kind of overreacting, right? And that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, it started out as an intellectual thing. My mother's a librarian. My first political act was I walked the picket lines with my mother before she, when she was a librarian in Stark County, Ohio, and they went on strike. And I was a kid. I walked the picket lines with my mom, and I learned what a labor union was. My parents loved folk music. They loved Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and all of that. And a lot of that was communist. I didn't know that. My parents kind of knew that, but I didn't know that. But a lot of the folk music that I would listen to when I was a kid was very communist. I'd be my parents would take me to the concert, and there'd be some guy up there with a guitar singing about the Spanish Civil War or the struggles of the working man or whatever. And it's just folk music, right? It's not, the people who go to those concerts are not communists or anything, but it's just folk music because of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Joe Hill and all that. Folks music has a very, very communist undertone to it, just because of a lot of different things. And then the other thing that was a big influence was when I was 12 years old, I went to Ecuador. My dad, has a side job leading nature tours, and so he was leading a nature tour in the Galapagos Islands. And before we went to Galapagos Islands, we went to Quito. And this was in 1999 when I was 12 years old, and they were in the middle of a famine imposed by neoliberalism. I didn't know that at the time, but there was a famine, and all these people were starving. And I remember getting off the plane and seeing all these desperately poor, starving people in Ecuador. And I was like in shock. I'd never seen that level of extreme poverty. All these children begging and all of this. And I remember thinking, wow, and just being blown away by that. I didn't know, but at the time, but years later, I learned that was because of neoliberalism. And that they had been forced to adopt the dollar. They'd been forced to privatize their state-run oil company. All the peasants in the countryside had lost their land. That was a man-made famine, right? They always tell us about Stalin. Oh, it was a man-made famine. This was a man-made famine. The U.S. imperialists, the international bankers, had sunk their fangs into Ecuador and said, if you want to get your development loans, you got to give up your currency and adopt the U.S. dollar. You got to sell off your state-run oil company. You've got to privatize. You got to let Monsanto own all your land. And Ecuador had been economically raped by neoliberalism, and people starved. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And I remember seeing that in Quito and being like in shock. I had never seen that level of poverty before. So all of that led to me, I realized I've been lied to. And then 9/11, after 9/11, I could tell that Iraq and Osama bin Laden were not the same, and that I was really uncomfortable with the ultra patriotism after 9/11 and the way, my family, we were part of this program. We hosted international students. We hosted a student from Pakistan. He was a Muslim, right? He talked about Islam. And then I remember at my school, after 9/11, we're learning about 9/11. Oh my God, it's, every teacher I had practically said that 9/11 happened because they're not Christian, right? That was what we were told, is that, they don't have the Bible. See, they believe in the Quran, and so they don't have the Bible that says thou shalt not kill. Really an ignorant thing to say, but that's why 9/11 happened, is they'd never read the Bible, right? It was really ignorant. And I would say, well, no, actually the Muslims, their religion does say, and people would be shocked. How did you know this? And I said, well, my family, we hosted a student from Pakistan. You know, a Muslim? You must be a terrorist. People were really ignorant, and I just knew enough that was bullshit. Yes, my family had met Muslims. Yes, I knew a Muslim. Yeah, and no, I didn't think 9/11 happened because they didn't have the Bible. And, and so I was really off put by the ultra patriotism after 9/11. And we were told, well, that 9/11 had happened because these people in the Middle East, they just hate our freedom, right? And they heard that we have freedom in America, and they were just like, kill them, they've got freedom. Like, that's what people believed, and that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. And the invasion of Iraq was completely ridiculous. That and I was against the war in Iraq, and we had to make candy like packets for the troops every morning in school, and we had to it was we're constantly we had like 15 patriotic assemblies every year that would turn into pro-war rallies. Basically, it's like it was like one thing to say you support the military, but then and then there's all these people that don't support the war because they're traitors and they hate America. And it was like everything was just this, like, after 9/11, my life, my little town kind of just turned into like a 24/7 military rally with Christian characteristics, and I was very alienated from it. And I'd already started to get interested in communism. So I got interested in the Iraq War movement and the Vietnam War movement. And I learned all about this, and I've gone down this rabbit hole. And, when I was in high school, I wanted to join communist groups. And I wrote letters to the different communist groups and said, tell me what you're about. And I checked out different communist groups, and there was a Maoist communist group that was in Cleveland that had a bookstore. And I remember visiting their bookstore, and they told me to sell newspapers. And I will never forget the day that changed my life. This is true. It might sound hokey, but it's true. The day that changed my life, it saved my life, was the day when I was 15 years old, and my mom dropped me off at the communist bookstore in Cleveland. And she said to me very nervously, don't leave the store. And I was supposed to listen to their speeches about the Iraq War. And then my mom would pick me up later when she was like shopping with my brother. So I was at the bookstore, and they had their speeches or whatever, their event about the Iraq War. And then they handed me a stack of newspapers and said, we're going to go out and sell the paper. And I was like, and they're like, yeah, we're going to go out and sell the newspaper. And I was 15 years old, and I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, we're going to go out and sell this newspaper. And I was thinking, like, you got to be crazy. Like, you want me to walk up to people I don't know and try to get them to buy a newspaper, pay actual money to buy a newspaper about communism? You got to be out of your mind. They said, no, we do it all the time. And they made me go out on the street, 15 years old, and walk up to people and try. And I could barely get the words out of my mouth. It was like, duh. I was so nervous. It was like the most terrifying thing, because my family had always been saying to me, stop talking about politics, right? You're making everybody mad. The way you raise your hand in class and question stuff, you got to stop it. You're embarrassing the family. Just cut this shit out, right? And so I was really like, I felt like if I was going out and talking about what I believed in, I was doing something wrong. So, when I was walking up to these people, it was like the most terrifying thing. I thought someone was going to punch me in the face. I thought they'd see I was selling a communist newspaper, and they'd say, fuck you, commie, and they'd punch me in the face. Never happened. I've never been punched in the face for selling a newspaper. I have been punched in the face before for many reasons, but that's another story. But never got punched in the face for selling a newspaper. But I was so like, oh, I can't do this. And I spent that afternoon selling newspapers. And the first newspaper I ever sold, I will never forget it. I was wearing my letterman's jacket. I was an athletic letterman. I had lettered. I'd played soccer my freshman year. I had a giant O for Orville, the little town I was from in Ohio, on my jacket. And I remember I walked up to this couple and tried to sell them the newspaper. And the man said, well, I don't agree with you, young man, but I'll buy your paper because you go to Oberlin College. You go to Oberlin College. And I see the O on your jacket, so I'll buy your newspaper. First newspaper I ever sold. Never will forget it. What's funny is that I didn't go to Oberlin College. That was for Orville. I was a high school kid. I didn't care. I was so happy to have finally sold a paper. And it's a wild story, but, and then when I went to college, my first year of college, I was in this, I was around, I guess. I was part of the circles of people that were around this Maoist communist group. And it was intense. We sold the newspaper every day. We were out there putting up posters and selling newspapers every day. And every weekend we were driving to another part of Ohio, or driving to another part of, driving to Indiana, or driving to Pennsylvania to go poster up another college. It was like, go, 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 and I'm really thankful for that. They were a very intense group. I just didn't agree with them. Right. And that's a whole nother story. But they really trained me to go out and do outreach, sell newspapers, argue with people, put up posters, hand out leaflets, and it was like, go, go, go. And they were a little bit intense. Let me just put it that way. Like, you'd have class. And they'd be like, we're going to go sell the paper. And I'd be like, well, I've got class. And they'd be like, oh, why don't you explain to the Iraqi children who got blown up this morning why your education is so much more important than, it's a little bit, they were a little bit intense, right? And that shit doesn't work. I'll just tell you that. A lot of communist groups used to do shit like that. And eventually, if someone talks that way to you, you just tell them to go fuck themselves, and you can't treat people like that. And that was one of the problems this communist group had, was the guilt tripping and the, people, when you start making demands on people, pretty soon people walk away, right? And you can't act that way. But I'm thankful that communist group, it was like boot camp, I was, I was in this, this communist group, and, my first year of college, it was like, go, 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 sell newspapers, drive to other states, put up posters, put up leaflets, how many newspapers did you sell? How many phone numbers do you have? I would call people. They'd have me call people on the phone they had an anti-Bush group that they had, against George W. Bush, to try to get Bush impeached. And they had me call people on the phone to donate, help us get an ad in the New York Times. And it was like very intense outreach political work. And it was very good for me. I learned to get out of my shell. I learned to talk to people. I learned to, I was quite a shy person, but, there was no room for shyness. You just got to, do it. And I'm thankful for that. And honestly, it was not ethical, right? I mean, when they first had me selling newspapers, I was underage. That's probably illegal. You probably can't make underage people go out and sell shit on the street. I don't care. I'm thankful they did that. And I didn't want to do it. I'll tell you that much. I was terrified. And they were like, no, you do this, or you're a bad person, basically, is what I was told. Well, you don't talk that way to people, but that's what they said to me. It's like, you have to do this. And I did it. And I'm thankful because it brought me out of my shell, and it made me, extroverted rather than introverted. It made me learn to hold my own. It made me proud of who I was. So I'm really thankful for that in a lot of ways. It was, that group that I was around is not the best group, honestly. And their politics, I just didn't agree with them. They were not really anti-imperialist, but they at least made me do the work. And doing the work is so much. That's what I'm really thankful for, because at this point, most of the communist groups have fallen apart, right? They've just kind of fallen apart. But I am old enough. I'm 38 years old. I'm actually only 37. I turned 38 at the end of December. I'm 37 years old, and I'm old enough to have been around when there were like functional communist groups, right? This was the Iraq War protest days, the Bush administration, where there was an anti-war movement that was against the invasion of Iraq, where communist groups were organizing the protests against the Iraq War. And they were actually organizing protests. They were actually recruiting people to be in their communist group to organize the protests. That was really good for me, because nowadays, a lot of these younger folks don't know what being in a group means. They don't know. They don't understand. I mean, it's like, there's some groups that are just internet clubs, and it's like the people don't know any better, right? It's like, what would I actually do, right? There was this one young woman who's in one of these communist groups, a very skilled young person. She's very young. She's like 22, 23. And I said to her, you should run for office as a communist. You should at least have your own YouTube channel talking about communist ideas. You should, you're too smart to be in this group. All your communist group does, you have Zoom calls about Stalin. It's like, and I said, you've got more to offer people. She was in PCUSA. And I was like, this is a joke. Like, what does PCUSA do? They don't do anything. They just have Zoom calls where they talk to each other about Stalin. I said, you have something to offer. She didn't take that well. Okay, she doesn't have to, right? Well, take it or leave it. But it's like, she doesn't know any better, right? She's not, if she was older, she would have known what a real group would do. I was in this communist group, and we organized national protests to call for Bush to be impeached. We sold newspapers. We put posters up everywhere. We were constantly out on the street arguing with people, trying to promote the communist line. We were doing outreach. We were building a movement. And, a lot of the younger people now have no conception of that. The idea that this could be anything other than a form of passive internet entertainment is lost on them. And that's why it's really important that I build CPI, because it's not just entertainment. We need to build a movement, right? We need there to be food banks in neighborhoods that are run by communists. No, that doesn't mean you go to some other group's thing and take a picture of yourself doing it. That's what there's certain other groups are doing. They think they're doing real activism. They're not, right? If you go to some church's food bank and take a selfie of yourself being there, that's not activism. We need food banks that are run by communists. We need community organizations that are run by communists. We need, anti-imperialist education. We need people that would never go looking for these ideas to be encountered with people who say, your enemy is not in China, your enemy is not in Russia, your enemy is not in Cuba or Iran, your enemy is the big bankers on Wall Street, your enemy is the Pentagon and the people that have been destroying this country and grinding us into poverty. Our real enemy is at home, and what we need is a government of action that fights for working families, to break the power of the big monopolies. That's what we need. We need a movement in this country that says that we need to stand up against Wall Street and the imperialists that are grinding this country into poverty. We need to oppose the danger of a new world war. We need to oppose the emerging low-wage police state, and we need to fight for working families. That's what we urgently need. And I've evolved quite a bit, right? I'm a Christian. I rediscovered my Christian faith, and I've realized that there are some flaws, that there's a reason that a lot of the communist countries, all of them pretty much have, the market reforms and have adopted the Deng Xiaoping model. But imperialism, monopolistic capitalism, that is the main enemy of humanity, and it is the enemy of the American people. And the American people are struggling right now. Our living standards are going down. Our roads are falling apart. Our bridges are falling down. Our water is not being purified. The American people have been royally fucked by imperialism. And we've got to get it through our heads that our enemy is the Wall Street bankers, and that we need a government that invests in people, not in private prisons, not in wars and destroying countries, not in opioids, not in derivative ripoff schemes, but a government that invests in people, because human beings are the source of all wealth. It is human labor power and our creative ability, our godlike spark of divinity. God is the creator of all things, but we human beings are the only species that has the ability to reinvent our environment and force the environment to serve us. We have a godlike spark of creative power, and we need a government that will invest in that and invest in human creative power and organize the economy rationally so that we can build and construct and build a world of vast abundance. That's what we need. And the reason we don't have that is because this country is run by the international bankers, Wall Street, the big monopolies, the imperialists, the globalists that run our country. They don't believe in that. They believe human beings are a cancer on Mother Earth. They want to depopulate. They want to drive down consumption, drive down the population to stabilize their system. Well, get rid of their system and instead have society control the economy and invest in human beings and unleash human creative power, right? Overcome the irrationality of the market and have an economy that is rationally organized to serve the interests of society overall. That is what we need. That is what we need. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need to defeat globalism, imperialism. We need to oppose the danger of a new world war, to oppose the emerging low-wage police state. That's what we need. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation stands for. Innovationism is our new breakthrough, our new understanding, based on where the world is in the 21st century, right? Just doing the old communism thing isn't exactly going to work for a number of reasons. I've talked about at great length. Go watch the slideshows. If you really want to know what we're all about, on this YouTube channel, you can go to the playlists on my YouTube channel and go to the slideshows. I got a number of slideshows on the history of communist groups, on innovationism and CPI, where we came from, our approach. We have a unique approach called innovationism, which I've been, writing about. We are the cutting edge. We are pioneering something new. We are building a new, exciting movement. We really are. And we have a new understanding, a new number of books, and we have changed the political conversation in America like you wouldn't believe. Our book was like, front page news during the election. It was all over, the book I wrote about Kamala Harris that they banned from Amazon was suddenly like, it was all over, mainstream outlets, and people were talking about it. I was interviewed by like Fox News local affiliates, and I was on InfoWars, and I was on all these mainstream outlets. We were marching in the streets with a big banner of "Only peace can make America great again," outside Madison Square Garden. I was interviewed in the New Yorker. We're getting it done, right? Our campaign, we were the groups that we were out in front of the federal courthouse in Tampa, standing with Uhuru. I've spoken with President Putin. I've spoken with the Iranian president. I had a sit down interview. We are the real deal. We're the real anti-imperialist movement of America, and we're building a real movement, not an internet fandom. And you should get involved. And we have this new understanding that celebrates human creative power and understands what AI means for the world economy, and why AI is going to mean that the classic labor boss situation is going to change. And it's rather about having an anti-monopoly government that invests in communities. We have a new breakthrough, right? Read what's on our website, cpiusa.org. You can read all about innovationism, our new breakthrough understanding. We have a new understanding that is very important for anti-imperialist organizing in our time. But anyway, it's past 1 a.m. It is a little bit late. So I'm going to say goodnight for now. Register for our event coming up in New Jersey. It's going to be a great event. Come to the event. If you're on the East Coast, if you're in the United States, come to our event. It's going to be absolutely awesome. I've been talking to all kinds of great people are coming. It's going to be absolutely tremendous. You can register on Eventbrite. Go ahead and be there at our event. You can join CPI, people that join. I've got to show Penny's video. I'm sorry. All right. I can't end yet. Got to show Penny's video. Penny has a video about getting around America versus Burkina Faso. So got to show Penny's video. So we'll show Penny's video, right? She sent it in. Penny is always doing great work. So we're going to show Penny's video. And then after that, I guess I can answer more questions if people got them. It is getting late. That's okay. Whatever. I'm here. I'm not planning to do anything really early in the morning tomorrow. All right. So let me put this video from Penny on about getting around America versus Burkina Faso. If anyone else has any more questions, best way to send them in is buy me a coffee. Buy me a coffee is the best way, the best way why would I not have a subscribe button? This is one of the weirdest messages I've got. Of course I have a subscribe button, like every YouTube channel does. What the fuck is that? Okay. And we got another. Penny sent 2 things in. Okay. But if anyone has any more questions, please send them via Buy Me a Coffee. All right. We're going to put Penny's video about getting around America versus Burkina Faso. We'll put that on. All right. Hold on. Getting around. Here we go.
Minneapolis has trains and buses, and that's one of the reasons that I used to like Minneapolis, is because there was lots of public transportation. But ever since the pandemic, ridership is down, and a lot of routes are being cut, like the North Star commuter rail. And new projects are over budget and taking forever. So what gives? Why is it so hard for the United States to figure out transportation? And Greyhounds are shutting down, and ridership is down. But in Burkina Faso, they're investing in transportation to connect people and to boost their economy. So what gives? You tell me.
The Met Council was met with some tough love today about the Southwest Light Rail project. Remember that? The largest public works project in state history. It's 14 miles of track, 16 train stations, new bridges, tunnels. Easy to forget since it's still a project and not a reality. It's supposed to be a reality right now, connecting people in Eden Prairie with downtown Minneapolis with lots of stops along the way. And as we sit here idle, still on year 7 and $2 billion later, state lawmakers are starting to get ticked off, especially when they got a look at an audit that came out this morning. Here's Gordon Severson.
3, 2, 1, throw. Nearly 7 years ago, local leaders broke ground on the Southwest Light Rail project. Back then, the budget was around $2 billion, with a completion date of 2023. Fast forward to today, and the latest estimates show the project will cost nearly $3 billion and won't be complete until 2027.
It is 85% complete.
Monday morning, state auditors released a new report that revealed the Met Council has had, quote, instances of non-compliance during construction, including inadequate monitoring of how contaminated soil was moved out of sites and project estimates that came back 2 to 5 times higher than their original estimates.
What was your reaction to the report released this morning?
Wasn't shocked. It's just more of the same.
Republican Senator Mark Curran was among several senators who voiced concerns during the presentation. He says it appears the Met Council could have saved money along the way, but missed those opportunities.
The decisions that they made don't appear to be made with any cost containment or the respect of the taxpayer dollars.
Democrat Senator Scott Dibble agrees.
Indicative of an agency that just knows that the money will be there and it has no personal skin in the game, no accountability.
In a statement, the Met Council says they are making changes, including better measures of cost estimation, payment verification, and better environmental oversight.
We know that there's many areas where we can improve.
While communities along this route wait for it to eventually be complete, everyone hopes there are no more stops along the way. Gordon Severson, KARE 11 News.
Oh, well, we'll stay tuned for that next chapter.
Let's head to the story.
It was a decision of the Council of Ministers on December 6, 2024, to acquire 500 buses to improve the mobility of pupils and students throughout Burkina Faso. Today, 155 buses are being handed over by the head of government, Rimtalpacha Emmanuel Ouedraogo, to Sotraco.
Beyond, of course, this specific group of pupils and students, the aim is therefore to improve mobility for all Burkinabe citizens. So by handing over the keys to this first batch of buses this morning, I have also tasked the Minister of State with taking the utmost care of them and above all making good use of them so that they can improve mobility for all Burkinabe citizens, and most importantly, that the management and maintenance live up to expectations and ensure that these are sustainable acquisitions.
And Rimtalpacha Emmanuel Ouedraogo called on all users to take great care of these buses, which are the result of the sacrifices made by all Burkinabe people. The head of government added that the remaining 375 buses will be delivered by the end of 2025.
This is a historic acquisition because since Sotraco was established, it has never had such a large fleet of buses. And as you can see, these are quality buses, which means that today Sotraco has reached a new level. So the significant challenge today for Sotraco and the ministry specifically in charge of urban mobility is to establish a comprehensive and robust management system that is not only highly efficient, but also absolutely ensures that these essential buses remain in active service for as long as humanly possible.
The purchase of these buses is fully financed by the Burkinabe state at more than 44 billion CFA francs, excluding taxes, with financial support from the Vista Bank Group. This marks an important milestone in the implementation of the government's vision, sustainable urban mobility as a driver of economic and social development.
Oh, okay, there's the bus. The buses are good. They come to you. They're really clean inside and the driver is very, well liked. He gives us directions and also the conditions for traveling on the bus. That's good.
And inside?
The inside is clean. It's clean, it's good. It's very luxurious, huh?
We are very satisfied with these buses. They are air-conditioned and we are very comfortable inside. There are no hassles and the neighborhoods are well served. What remains for us to do is to pray for the authorities and for peace in the world. If you take these buses, you will see for yourself that they are much better and well air-conditioned. The president has made great efforts. We are grateful to him. Now, we can appreciate the difference between the old buses and the ones that were acquired recently. The country faces enormous challenges, but the Burkinabe have always shown themselves to be resilient. Some of our compatriots have died and others have been fortunate enough to be resettled. Despite these achievements that already speak in his favor, the president has decided to provide us with new buses that will make our daily lives easier. May God grant him health and the strength to do better. Long live President Ibrahim Traoré. He has our complete trust. We will do everything for him to ensure a sure march towards development. We have just received these buses. We are proud of what the president has done for his children, whom we are everywhere. We are represented and are keeping an eye on him. We assure him of our support no matter what happens.
All right. Okay, and as far as your next question, Penny said, did you hear about the elaborate Ukrainian-UK plot to steal MiG-31 and detonate Kinzhal missile in Romanian airspace? I heard something about it, but I'm not ready to go into great detail about it. But I have heard the news, and I do pay attention to that kind of thing. So I will probably have more to say about that on a future stream. But thank you, everybody. I'm going to put on the closing music. I'll be back probably tomorrow, right? But yeah, we're doing great stuff. Join the Center for Political Innovation. We're doing great stuff. All right, dare to struggle, dare to win. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.